I was sitting in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline, holding the exact forensic audit documents that would send my own father to federal prison for a very long time. The silence in the room was suffocating. 10 corporate board members stared at me, waiting for my final verdict. To my left, my mother leaned over her manicured hand, gripping my wrist so hard her acrylic nails dug into my skin. She smelled of expensive peppermint and sheer desperation. "Family protects family, Gwen," she whispered, her voice trembling with a panic I had never heard before. "You owe us." I stared at the thick manila folder under my palms. I felt the sharp edges of the paper inside, the paper that held the truth. My father sat across the mahogany table, sweating through his custom Italian suit, the very fabric of his untouchable persona unraveling before my eyes. My younger brother, Preston, the golden heir, was weeping into his hands like a child. For 31 years, I had been their disposable workhorse, the invisible daughter expected to clean up their messes, fund their luxury lifestyles, and shrink myself so their egos could fill the room. And now, cornered by their own greed, they wanted me to cover up a multi-million-dollar fraud to save them from handcuffs. The nerve of it made my blood run cold. My name is Gwen Tran. I am 31 years old. And before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my toxic family and took over a legacy empire, I want you to do something for me. If you have ever poured your soul into a job or a family, only to watch someone else steal the credit while treating you like dirt, you are in the right place. Welcome to Jessica Told Stories. Drop your age and where you are tuning in from in the comments right now. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that sometimes setting boundaries means burning the bridge while they are still standing on it. To understand how I fired my blood relatives and watched their high society lives crumble to dust, you have to rewind. You have to see how they pushed me to the edge of a cliff, expecting me to quietly fall in. You need to understand the audacity of people who demand loyalty from the very person they spent decades tearing apart. They honestly believed my silence was weakness. They mistook my patience for submission. But they forgot one crucial detail. When you force someone to do all the heavy lifting, you inadvertently build their strength. And my strength was about to become their worst nightmare. 6 months prior, the world looked very different. I was the chief operating officer of Tran Heritage Group, a premier luxury real estate firm in New York City. We had just secured the Hudson Yards commercial acquisition. It was a $50 million behemoth. The deal required 6 months of grueling negotiations, untangling decades of municipal red tape and outmaneuvering 3 rival firms. For the final 72 hours before the ink dried, I survived on lukewarm espresso and the stubborn will to close. My eyes burned from staring at contract clauses. The tension of a ticking clock radiated through my shoulders. When the seller finally signed, the relief washed over me like a cold rain. We had secured the crown jewel of the fiscal year. My brother Preston spent that exact same 72 hours skiing in Aspen. Yet that evening, inside a private dining room at a Michelin-starred Tribeca restaurant, the narrative shifted. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the imported linen tablecloth. Our parents, Kenneth and Vivian, hosted the celebration dinner. Kenneth sat at the head of the table. He kept his posture rigid, wearing the bespoke tailored suits he used as armor. He was the acting CEO, the gatekeeper of the Tran legacy. Beside him sat Vivian. Her pearls gleamed under the lights. Her smile was practiced and flawless. She orchestrated our family optics with the precision of a military general. Preston arrived 20 minutes late. He wore a tan cashmere blazer, His skin carried the fresh, sun-kissed flush of a luxury vacation. He slid into the chair opposite mine, signaling the sommelier before even acknowledging the table. "Rough flight," Preston said, loosening his collar. The turbulence over Colorado was a nightmare. I stared at the rim of my water glass. I was 31 years old, running the daily operations of a legacy empire, yet in this room, I felt the familiar shrinkage, the conditioned silence. The sommelier approached to pour a vintage Bordeaux. Preston leaned back, swirling the dark liquid in his glass, and smirked at the server. "You know traditional real estate is a dying breed," Preston boasted, his voice carrying loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Brick and mortar, too slow. I am telling you, decentralized ledgers are the future. Offshore crypto, foolproof returns. I have a connection in Dubai setting up a digital property exchange. It is untouchable." The sommelier offered a polite, strained nod and stepped away. I pressed my lips together. Preston held the title of Vice President of Acquisitions. Kenneth created that role entirely to justify a six-figure salary for his son. Preston understood nothing of zoning laws, market fluctuations, or cap rates. He understood optics. He understood how to sound important while holding a drink. Kenneth tapped his silver fork against his champagne flute. The delicate chime silenced the room. My father stood raising his glass. "Tonight we celebrate a milestone," Kenneth began, his baritone voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Tran Heritage Group has secured a $50 million anchor in Hudson Yards. It is a testament to vision, to relentless drive, to the future of this family." I let out a slow, quiet breath, allowing myself a fraction of pride. Then Kenneth turned his body away from me. He raised his glass toward the tan cashmere blazer. "To my son," Kenneth said. His eyes shone with a pride he never directed my way. "Preston, your strategic oversight on this acquisition was brilliant. You steered the ship, you delivered the prize. To the heir of Tran Heritage, to Preston," Vivian echoed, beaming. Preston raised his glass, offering a humble shrug that made my stomach turn. "Could not have done it without a good support team." A good support team. I cut into my steak. The knife scraped the porcelain plate a little too hard. The lifelong dynamic played out exactly as it always did. I was the workhorse. I did the heavy lifting, the sleepless nights, the risk management. Preston simply stood at the finish line, waiting for the medal to be placed around his neck. And I said nothing. I swallowed the injustice because fighting back meant disrupting the peace. And Vivian Tran did not tolerate disruption. Before I could take a bite, my phone vibrated in my purse. I glanced at the screen. It was Evan, our junior comptroller. It was 10:30 on a Friday night. Evan never called after hours, unless the building was on fire. I excused myself from the table, stepping into the quiet, carpeted hallway near the coat check. "Evan, tell me this can wait until Monday," Gwen Evans said. His voice sounded tight. A subtle tremble of panic bled through the receiver. "I am sorry. I was running the end-of-week reconciliations for the new acquisition, the escrow accounts." "What about them?" "They do not balance. There is a discrepancy, a big one." The ambient jazz music from the dining room seemed to fade into a hollow hum. "Define big." "6 figures," Evan replied. "The funds are just missing. Routed to a holding company I do not recognize. If the auditors catch this on Monday morning, we are looking at severe regulatory violations." A cold spike of adrenaline pierced my exhaustion. "Do not touch anything. Freeze the ledger. I am heading to the office now." I ended the call and walked back into the dining room. The table was laughing. Preston was recounting a story about a ski instructor. "I have to leave," I said, grabbing my trench coat from the back of my chair. "There is an issue with the escrow reconciliation." Vivian stopped mid-laugh. Her flawless smile tightened into a thin line of disapproval. Gwen, really? Can you not just enjoy your brother's moment for one evening? You always have to make everything about the work. The work is the only reason we have anything to celebrate, Mother, I replied. The words slipped out sharper than I intended. Kenneth did not even look up from his wine. Let her go, Vivian. She has no head for celebrating business, only crunching numbers. Preston, tell me more about this Dubai connection. I turned my back on them and walked out into the biting chill of the New York night. 30 minutes later, I stood alone in the 52nd floor executive suite of Tran Heritage Group. The skyscraper was empty, quiet, and dark, save for the glow of my dual monitors. The city lights of Manhattan stretched out below me like a grid of endless ambition, a constant reminder of the empire my grandfather built from nothing. I walked past the row of empty cubicles, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, the silence amplifying the thud of my own heartbeat. I unlocked my terminal and pulled up the corporate ledgers. Evan was right. The numbers did not align. A staggering sum of capital had been quietly bled from our operational reserves and funneled into an obscure offshore account. I scrolled through pages of transactions tracing the digital footprints. Each click of my mouse felt unusually loud. The deeper I went, the more the architecture of the theft revealed itself. The funds were not just missing. They were systematically siphoned over the span of 3 days. The exact 3 days Preston was supposedly skiing in Aspen. The Hudson Yards triumph was a hollow shell. My family was downtown eating imported Wagyu beef and toasting to an illusion of success, while I sat in the dark, staring at a ticking time bomb. I rolled up my sleeves. The exhaustion faded into a cold, clinical focus. I reached for my notepad and a pen, writing down the routing numbers. I had no idea that digging into this discrepancy would be the catalyst that would unravel my entire life. I had spent my career protecting Tran Heritage Group from external threats, never realizing the true danger was sharing my last name. And I certainly did not know that the physical stress of this very night was about to push my own body to a lethal breaking point, leaving me begging for help from people who simply did not care if I lived or died. I was still staring at the routing numbers, my eyes straining against the blue light of the monitor when the first wave hit me. It did not start as a dull ache. It arrived as a sharp, searing tear through my lower abdomen. A pain so sudden and intense, it stole the breath directly from my lungs. I gasped, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so tight, my knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. I tried to stand, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just the 72 hours of caffeine and relentless stress catching up to my system. But my legs refused to hold my weight. I collapsed onto the carpet. The cool synthetic fibers pressed against my cheek as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead and the back of my neck. The pain radiated through my spine, a blinding, breathless agony that made the spreadsheets on my screen blur into meaningless, glowing shapes. I managed to drag my phone from my trench coat pocket with trembling fingers and dialed 911. My voice barely registered above a hoarse whisper when the emergency dispatcher answered. The next 2 hours fractured into disjointed, terrifying flashes. The harsh wail of the ambulance siren echoing off the empty concrete canyons of Manhattan. The blinding, fluorescent lights of the Mount Sinai emergency room passing above me as a gurney rattled down a busy linoleum hallway. The distinct, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and iodine burning my nostrils. A doctor in dark blue scrubs stood over me, his expression grave and urgent. His mouth moved, delivering words that seemed to belong to a medical drama, not my own reality. Ruptured ectopic pregnancy, severe internal hemorrhaging. We need to get you into an operating room right now, or you are not going to make it. I lay on the narrow gurney, shivering beneath a thin paper blanket. A nurse taped an intravenous line to the back of my hand, her touch gentle but brisk. Terror gripped my chest, squeezing tighter than the physical pain in my stomach. I was 31 years old, the chief operating officer of a legendary real estate empire. A woman who negotiated with ruthless developers on a daily basis. Yet in that freezing, sterile room, facing the very real prospect of my own mortality, I felt like a frightened, lonely child. I needed my mother. Despite every cold remark over the years, despite every single time she cast me aside to celebrate Preston, the primal biological instinct to seek comfort from my parents overpowered all my logic. With shaking, ice-cold fingers, I unlocked my phone and dialed Vivian's number. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. "Gwen, what on earth is it now?" Vivian answered. Her tone was laced with thick, unapologetic irritation. In the background, I could hear the faint, elegant clinking of fine china, the soft murmur of polite conversation, and the delicate notes of a string quartet. "Mom." I choked out a tear, finally escaping and tracing a hot path down my temple. "I am at Mount Sinai Hospital. The doctors say I have internal bleeding. I have to go into emergency surgery right now. I am so scared." There was a long pause on the line. For a fraction of a second, I waited for the maternal panic. I waited for her to ask which floor I was on. I waited for her to say she and Kenneth were leaving the restaurant, grabbing a cab and rushing to my side. Instead, I heard a heavy, exasperated sigh. "Gwen, we are at the artisanal bakery in Soho," Vivian said. Her voice dropped into a hushed, annoyed whisper, as if my medical emergency was an embarrassing social faux pas. "This is the exclusive tasting for Preston and Audrey's wedding cake. Getting this private appointment took months." I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath hitching in my throat. "Mom, I might not survive this surgery." "Oh, please, do not be dramatic," Vivian scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You are in a hospital. They have doctors for a reason. We can't deal with this right now, Gwen. Preston's caterer is waiting." "You have always been independent. You will figure it out." The line clicked dead. A hollow dial tone buzzed in my ear. I lowered the phone to my chest, the device slipping from my weak grasp. The attending nurse leaned over gently, taking the phone away, offering a look of profound pity that stung worse than the surgical needles piercing my skin. I closed my eyes as the anesthesia flowed through my IV line, pulling me down into a dark, dreamless void. I went into major surgery entirely alone, carrying the weight of my mother's dismissal into the dark. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh, glaring lights of the emergency room had been replaced by the soft, filtered morning sun of a private recovery ward. My mouth felt like dry cotton. The dull throb in my abdomen was muted by heavy doses of painkillers. I turned my head heavily against the pillow and found him sitting in the chair beside my bed. Nathan. Nathan was a senior corporate auditor based in Chicago. We had met 2 years ago during a brutal multi-state merger where we sat on opposite sides of a negotiation table. He was sharp, highly analytical, and possessed a quiet, steady empathy that stood in stark contrast to the loud, performative chaos of the Tran family. He did not care about the Tran heritage legacy. He did not care about my title. He just cared about me. The moment I had missed our scheduled goodnight text, his intuition told him something was wrong. He had taken the first available red-eye flight out of O'Hare Airport, arriving in New York before the sun even rose, tracking me down through my assistant. He leaned forward the moment he saw my eyes flutter open, taking my hand in both of his. His grip was warm and deeply grounding. "You are safe," he murmured, leaning in to kiss my knuckles. The doctor said the surgery was successful. You just need to rest. I nodded weakly, my gaze drifting around the room. I noticed a large green leaf peeking out from the corner near the window. It was the prized Monstera plant from my executive office. I had cultivated it for years, a small piece of vibrant, growing life inside that sterile, cutthroat corporate environment. Nathan saw my gaze shift toward the pot. I stopped by your office to grab your laptop and charger, he explained softly, knowing I would panic about work the second I woke up. The air conditioning in that suite was freezing. The soil in the pot was bone dry, the leaves were drooping, turning yellow at the edges. It looked like it was dying in the dark. So I watered it and brought it here. It needed some actual sunlight. I stared at the broad green leaves. The plant was a living mirror, reflecting my own existence. I had spent years trapped in a freezing, sterile environment, starved of basic care and affection, quietly withering away, while my family extracted every ounce of value I possessed. My parents had left me to wither in the dark. Nathan had crossed half the country to nurture me back to life. I asked Nathan to hand me my phone. He hesitated, warning me to rest and keep my stress levels low, but he relented when he saw the cold determination settling in my eyes. The screen illuminated, displaying a flurry of missed emails from the office regarding the escrow accounts. There were 0 missed calls from my parents. There were 0 texts from Preston, checking to see if I had survived the night. I opened my social media feed. At the very top of the timeline sat a brand new post from Vivian Tran. It was a high-resolution, perfectly filtered photo of 4 crystal champagne flutes raised in a celebratory toast over a decadent tiered fondant cake. Preston, Audrey, Kenneth, and Vivian. All of them smiling, all of them looking radiant and unbothered. The caption read, "Family first." A strange, powerful sensation washed over me in that hospital bed. The physical pain, the lingering sorrow, and the desperate childlike yearning for their approval evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that sharpened my mind. They had shown me exactly who they were. When my life was literally hanging by a thread, they chose vanilla frosting and champagne over my survival. They did not view me as a daughter, a sister, or even a human being. I was merely a corporate asset, a machine designed to fund their luxury and secure their social status. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I pressed the 2 buttons on the side of the device and captured the screen. The image of those champagne flutes saved directly to my camera roll. I opened my digital files, created a brand new encrypted folder and titled it Receipts. I moved the screenshot inside. This was the first piece of evidence, the foundational brick of a new reality. I had spent my entire life shielding the Tran family from consequence. I had covered Preston's endless mistakes and absorbed Kenneth's harsh criticisms. I had played the good, obedient daughter while they took everything I built and claimed it as their own. But staring at that folder, a silent vow formed in my mind. I was done being their shield. If they wanted to treat me like a disposable corporate asset, then I would start operating exactly like one. I would protect my bottom line. I would calculate my returns. And I would prepare for a hostile takeover. What I did not anticipate as I lay recovering in that hospital bed was that my family was already planning their next financial strike. Returning to the office prematurely to handle the mounting medical debt, I expected a mountain of paperwork. Instead, I would discover an act of theft so bold it would force me to realize my brother's incompetence had a much higher price tag than I ever imagined, and Kenneth expected me to pay the bill. I was still staring at the routing numbers, my eyes straining against the blue light of the monitor, when the first wave hit me. It did not start as a dull ache. It arrived as a sharp, searing tear through my lower abdomen, a pain so sudden and intense it stole the breath directly from my lungs. I gasped, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so tight my knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. I tried to stand, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just the 72 hours of caffeine and relentless stress catching up to my system. But my legs refused to hold my weight. I collapsed onto the carpet. The cool synthetic fibers pressed against my cheek as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead and the back of my neck. The pain radiated through my spine, a blinding, breathless agony that made the spreadsheets on my screen blur into meaningless, glowing shapes. I managed to drag my phone from my trench coat pocket with trembling fingers and dialed 911. My voice barely registered above a hoarse whisper when the emergency dispatcher answered. The next 2 hours fractured into disjointed, terrifying flashes. The harsh wail of the ambulance siren echoing off the empty concrete canyons of Manhattan. The blinding fluorescent lights of the Mount Sinai emergency room passing above me as a gurney rattled down a busy linoleum hallway. The distinct, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and iodine burning my nostrils. A doctor in dark blue scrubs stood over me, his expression grave and urgent. His mouth moved, delivering words that seemed to belong to a medical drama, not my own reality. Ruptured ectopic pregnancy. Severe internal hemorrhaging. We need to get you into an operating room right now, or you are not going to make it. I lay on the narrow gurney, shivering beneath a thin paper blanket. A nurse taped an intravenous line to the back of my hand, her touch gentle but brisk. Terror gripped my chest, squeezing tighter than the physical pain in my stomach. I was 31 years old, the chief operating officer of a legendary real estate empire, a woman who negotiated with ruthless developers on a daily basis. Yet in that freezing, sterile room, facing the very real prospect of my own mortality, I felt like a frightened, lonely child. I needed my mother. Despite every cold remark over the years, despite every single time she cast me aside to celebrate Preston, the primal biological instinct to seek comfort from my parents overpowered all my logic. With shaking, ice-cold fingers, I unlocked my phone and dialed Vivian's number. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. "Gwen, what on earth is it now?" Vivian answered. Her tone was laced with thick, unapologetic irritation. In the background, I could hear the faint, elegant clinking of fine china, the soft murmur of polite conversation, and the delicate notes of a string quartet. "Mom." I choked out a tear, finally escaping and tracing a hot path down my temple. I am at Mount Sinai Hospital. The doctors say I have internal bleeding. I have to go into emergency surgery right now. I am so scared. There was a long pause on the line. For a fraction of a second, I waited for the maternal panic. I waited for her to ask which floor I was on. I waited for her to say she and Kenneth were leaving the restaurant, grabbing a cab, and rushing to my side. Instead, I heard a heavy, exasperated sigh. "Gwen, we are at the artisanal bakery in Soho," Vivian said. Her voice dropped into a hushed, annoyed whisper, as if my medical emergency was an embarrassing social faux pas. "This is the exclusive tasting for Preston and Audrey's wedding cake. Getting this private appointment took months." I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath hitching in my throat. "Mom, I might not survive this surgery." "Oh, please, do not be dramatic," Vivian scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You are in a hospital. They have doctors for a reason. We can't deal with this right now, Gwen. Preston's caterer is waiting." "You have always been independent. You will figure it out." The line clicked dead. A hollow dial tone buzzed in my ear. I lowered the phone to my chest, the device slipping from my weak grasp. The attending nurse leaned over, gently taking the phone away, offering a look of profound pity that stung worse than the surgical needles piercing my skin. I closed my eyes as the anesthesia flowed through my IV line, pulling me down into a dark, dreamless void. I went into major surgery entirely alone, carrying the weight of my mother's dismissal into the dark. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh, glaring lights of the emergency room had been replaced by the soft, filtered morning sun of a private recovery ward. My mouth felt like dry cotton. The dull throb in my abdomen was muted by heavy doses of painkillers. I turned my head heavily against the pillow and found him sitting in the chair beside my bed. Nathan. Nathan was a senior corporate auditor based in Chicago. We had met 2 years ago during a brutal multi-state merger where we sat on opposite sides of a negotiation table. He was sharp, highly analytical, and possessed a quiet, steady empathy that stood in stark contrast to the loud, performative chaos of the Tran family. He did not care about the Tran heritage legacy. He did not care about my title. He just cared about me. The moment I had missed our scheduled goodnight text, his intuition told him something was wrong. He had taken the first available red-eye flight out of O'Hare Airport, arriving in New York before the sun even rose, tracking me down through my assistant. He leaned forward the moment he saw my eyes flutter open, taking my hand in both of his. His grip was warm and deeply grounding. "You are safe," he murmured, leaning in to kiss my knuckles. "The doctor said the surgery was successful. You just need to rest." I nodded weakly, my gaze drifting around the room. I noticed a large green leaf peeking out from the corner near the window. It was the prized Monstera plant from my executive office. I had cultivated it for years, a small piece of vibrant growing life inside that sterile, cutthroat corporate environment. Nathan saw my gaze shift toward the pot. "I stopped by your office to grab your laptop and charger," he explained softly, knowing I would panic about work the second I woke up. The air conditioning in that suite was freezing. The soil in the pot was bone dry, the leaves were drooping, turning yellow at the edges. It looked like it was dying in the dark. So I watered it and brought it here. It needed some actual sunlight. I stared at the broad green leaves. The plant was a living mirror reflecting my own existence. I had spent years trapped in a freezing, sterile environment, starved of basic care and affection, quietly withering away, while my family extracted every ounce of value I possessed. My parents had left me to wither in the dark. Nathan had crossed half the country to nurture me back to life. I asked Nathan to hand me my phone. He hesitated, warning me to rest and keep my stress levels low, but he relented when he saw the cold determination settling in my eyes. The screen illuminated, displaying a flurry of missed emails from the office regarding the escrow accounts. There were 0 missed calls from my parents. There were 0 texts from Preston, checking to see if I had survived the night. I opened my social media feed. At the very top of the timeline sat a brand new post from Vivian Tran. It was a high-resolution, perfectly filtered photo of 4 crystal champagne flutes raised in a celebratory toast over a decadent tiered fondant cake. Preston, Audrey, Kenneth, and Vivian, all of them smiling, all of them looking radiant and unbothered. The caption read, "Family first." A strange, powerful sensation washed over me in that hospital bed. The physical pain, the lingering sorrow, and the desperate, childlike yearning for their approval evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that sharpened my mind. They had shown me exactly who they were. When my life was literally hanging by a thread, they chose vanilla frosting and champagne over my survival. They did not view me as a daughter, a sister, or even a human being. I was merely a corporate asset, a machine designed to fund their luxury and secure their social status. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I pressed the 2 buttons on the side of the device and captured the screen. The image of those champagne flutes saved directly to my camera roll. I opened my digital files, created a brand new encrypted folder, and titled it Receipts. I moved the screenshot inside. This was the first piece of evidence, the foundational brick of a new reality. I had spent my entire life shielding the Tran family from consequence. I had covered Preston's endless mistakes and absorbed Kenneth's harsh criticisms. I had played the good, obedient daughter while they took everything I built and claimed it as their own. But staring at that folder, a silent vow formed in my mind. I was done being their shield. If they wanted to treat me like a disposable corporate asset, then I would start operating exactly like one. I would protect my bottom line. I would calculate my returns. And I would prepare for a hostile takeover. What I did not anticipate as I lay recovering in that hospital bed was that my family was already planning their next financial strike. Returning to the office prematurely to handle the mounting medical debt, I expected a mountain of paperwork. Instead, I would discover an act of theft so bold it would force me to realize my brother's incompetence had a much higher price tag than I ever imagined, and Kenneth expected me to pay the bill. The physical cost of returning to work a mere 8 days after emergency surgery felt like walking through waist-deep water. Every step from the black car to the revolving glass doors of the Tran Heritage Building sent a dull, throbbing ache radiating across my lower abdomen. My doctor had recommended 6 weeks of bed rest. The American healthcare system dictated a very different timeline. The out-of-network surgical fees, the emergency room co-pays, and the anesthesiologist bills had already started flooding my inbox, carrying numbers that could easily bankrupt a normal family. But I was not supposed to be a normal family. I was the chief operating officer of a real estate empire. I had a $250,000 executive bonus scheduled for disbursement that very morning, my contracted reward for closing the Hudson Yards acquisition. I pressed the elevator button for the 52nd floor, leaning my weight against the polished steel wall to hide my physical weakness from the junior analysts whispering in the lobby. I navigated the quiet corridor to my office. The space felt hollow. Nathan had taken my dying plant back to our apartment to nurse it back to health, leaving a bare spot near the window. I sat down in my leather chair, taking a slow, shallow breath, and woke up my terminal. I navigated directly to the corporate payroll portal. I needed to transfer those funds to clear the mounting medical debt before the invoices went to collections. I clicked the authorization tab. The screen loaded. My scheduled bonus payout read $0.00. I blinked the blue light of the monitor stinging my tired eyes. I refreshed the page. The digits remained unchanged. A hollow metallic ringing started in my ears. I opened the quarterly ledger tracing the executive compensation lines. The funds had not vanished into thin air. They had been manually diverted 24 hours prior, approved by a single administrator, Kenneth Tran. I stood up so fast my surgical incisions flared with sharp, burning pain. I ignored the warning signs from my body, marching out of my office and straight down the hall toward the CEO suite. Kenneth's executive assistant tried to stand and intercept me, stammering something about a conference call, but I pushed past her and shoved the heavy oak door open. My father sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of architectural blueprints. He wore a crisp white shirt, his silver hair perfectly styled. He did not look up when the door hit the wall. "Where is my bonus?" I asked. My voice came out low, stripped of any polite corporate veneer. Kenneth calmly capped his fountain pen. He closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands over the leather desk pad. "Close the door, Gwen. We do not need the interns hearing family business." I pushed the door shut until the latch clicked, keeping my eyes locked on his face. "My bonus," I repeated. "The $250,000 I earned for closing Hudson Yards. The payroll portal says it was zeroed out. It was reallocated," Kenneth stated, his tone as casual as if we were discussing ordering extra toner for the printers. "Reallocated to where?" "To plug the hole your brother dug," Kenneth replied, leaning back in his chair. "That Dubai crypto exchange Preston bragged about at dinner? It was a Ponzi scheme. The digital property ledger crashed overnight. Preston lost a substantial sum of our operational reserves. I had to quietly shift internal capital to balance the quarterly books before the board noticed the missing liquid assets. Your bonus covered the final deficit." I stared at him, my fingernails biting into the palms of my hands. "You stole my contracted compensation to cover Preston's gambling debts." "Do not use that tone with me," Kenneth snapped, his eyes narrowing with icy disapproval. "It is not theft. It is wealth management. Preston is marrying Audrey next month. Her family expects a certain caliber of financial strength. Preston needs marital optics. He needs to show his new in-laws that he is a titan, not a liability." "And what about me?" I asked, my voice trembling with a suppressed, scorching rage. "I just got out of the hospital. I have surgical bills. I am getting married to Nathan." Kenneth waved a hand through the air, dismissing my entire existence with a single flick of his wrist. "Nathan is a senior auditor. He earns a sensible living. You live in a nice condo. You do not need the money, Gwen. Preston does. Family protects family. You should be proud to support your brother's future." The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The room seemed to tilt. Staring at my father, the immaculate CEO, my mind pulled me backward in time. I was 12 years old again, standing in our childhood dining room. I had spent 3 weeks building a flawless balsa wood architectural model of the Chrysler Building for the State Science Fair. I had carefully cut every tiny window, gluing the fragile pieces with aching precision. Preston, who was 10 at the time, had thrown a tantrum because his own project, a papier-mâché volcano, looked terrible. In a fit of jealous rage, Preston swung his baseball bat and smashed my tower into splinters. I had fallen to the floor sobbing over the ruined pieces of my hard work. Kenneth had walked into the room. He did not punish Preston. Instead, Kenneth scooped up the broken pieces of my tower, glued them back together in a crooked, sloppy mess, and handed the project to my brother. "Boys need the confidence," Gwen Kenneth had said to my 12-year-old self, wiping away my tears with a cold handkerchief. "He is the heir. He has to learn how to win. You can always build another one." I blinked, the memory fading, returning me to the cold reality of the executive suite. The conditioning ran so deep it felt etched into my bones. The instinct to lower my head to accept the injustice, to swallow the theft and go back to my desk, screamed in my mind. For 3 decades, I had played the role of the silent shock absorber for their failures. I looked at Kenneth. I saw the quiet expectation in his eyes, waiting for me to back down. My throat tightened. I did not scream. I did not throw the blueprints off his desk. I simply turned around and walked out of his office, the silence ringing louder than any shouted curse. When I returned to my Upper East Side apartment that evening, the carefully constructed dam inside me finally broke. I dropped my leather tote bag on the entryway console and sank onto the hardwood floor, the physical pain and the emotional betrayal converging into a heavy, suffocating weight. Nathan found me there. He did not offer empty platitudes. He sat on the floor beside me, pulling me against his chest, letting me breathe until the panic subsided. I told him everything. The stolen bonus, the crypto scheme, the marital optics. Nathan stood up, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He walked into the home office and brought out his personal laptop, setting it on the kitchen island. He opened a blank, encrypted spreadsheet. If they want to treat you like a bank, then we are going to act like federal regulators. Nathan said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Tell me every single dollar they have taken from you. Not just today. Everything. I sat on the bar stool, my mind shifting from the role of a wounded daughter to a calculating executive. We built the ledger of theft. We documented the $250,000 bonus. We traced backward, logging the phantom consulting fees routed to Preston over the last 5 years. We calculated the thousands of hours of unpaid overtime I worked to fix Kenneth's outdated leasing contracts. We added the cost of the emergency room visit they caused by stressing me to the point of a physical rupture. Row by row, the spreadsheet grew. It was no longer just a list of grievances. It was an arsenal. The encrypted file represented the undeniable mathematical truth of my exploitation. It was the foundation of my retaliation. Just as Nathan hit save on the encrypted drive, my cell phone chimed from the living room couch. I walked over and picked up the device. It was a new voicemail from Audrey Preston's fiancé. I tapped the speaker icon. Audrey's voice filled the quiet apartment, dripping with a sugary, artificial sweetness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hi, Gwen," Audrey chirped. "Hope you are feeling better after your little hospital trip. Listen, Kenneth and Vivian are taking Preston and me out to dinner tomorrow night, and they want you there. We have to discuss a tiny favor regarding your apartment. Preston and I were looking at the floor plans, and we just think it is perfect. See you tomorrow." The voicemail ended with a cheerful beep. I stared at the phone, the blood turning to ice in my veins. They had stolen my credit. They had ignored my brush with death. They had drained my bank account, and now they were coming for my home. The battle lines were no longer being drawn. The war had already begun. I walked into the private dining room of the exclusive Midtown restaurant 24 hours after hearing that voicemail. The air conditioning chilled the damp skin on the back of my neck. My surgical incisions still throbbed with a dull and persistent ache, a constant reminder of the physical toll my family had extracted from me just days prior. The maitre d' pulled out my chair, the heavy mahogany scraping softly against the plush carpet. Kenneth and Vivian sat across from me. Beside them sat Preston and his fiancée, Audrey. The table was adorned with imported white orchids and crystal stemware. Audrey was busy spreading silk fabric swatches across the linen tablecloth, her manicured fingers tapping excitedly against a muted silver sample. She was the daughter of a prominent shipping magnate, raised in a world where every desire was met with a swift financial transaction. She fit perfectly into the Tran family ecosystem. "So glad you could make it," Gwen Vivian said, offering a tight, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "You look a bit pale, dear. You really should try a warmer blush." I ignored the critique, folding my hands in my lap to hide their slight tremble. "What is this tiny favor Audrey mentioned on the phone?" Preston, swirling an olive in his martini glass, leaned back and smirked. "It is not really a favor. It is more of a strategic family realignment. We are upgrading our lifestyle before the wedding." Kenneth set his phone face down on the table, signaling that the pleasantries were over. He folded his hands, adopting the exact posture he used during hostile corporate takeovers. Gwen Kenneth began, his voice smooth and unyielding. "You own a 3-bedroom condominium on the Upper East Side. It is a prime piece of real estate, very close to the private schools Audrey prefers, and it features the exact open floor plan needed to host our executive galas." My heart performed a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I purchased that condo 5 years ago. It was the only thing I owned free and clear of Tran Heritage Group. I saved every penny from my early commissions, sacrificing vacations and weekends to secure the down payment. That property was my sanctuary. It was the one place where I was just Gwen, not the tireless corporate workhorse. I am well aware of the floor plan, Father, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. I live there, not for much longer. Audrey chimed in, holding up the silver silk swatch to the light. Preston and I are going to gut the kitchen. We need marble countertops. The current granite is incredibly dated, Gwen. I cannot believe you lived with it this long. I stared at Audrey, trying to process the sheer audacity radiating from her pristine smile. You are not renovating my kitchen. Kenneth cleared his throat, a sharp sound that demanded immediate obedience. We are executing a transfer of assets. Tomorrow morning, our legal department will send you the paperwork to sign the deed of your condominium over to the Tran Heritage Family Trust. It is a simple restructuring. The trust will hold the deed, and Preston will reside there as the primary beneficiary. In corporate legalese, he was executing a flawless theft. By placing the deed into a trust he controlled, Kenneth was stripping away my ownership and gifting my hard-earned home to my brother as a wedding present. I would walk away with zero equity. Preston would gain a multi-million-dollar penthouse without spending a single dime. You want me to surrender my home? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Vivian sighed, waving her hand as if I were a child refusing to eat vegetables. Do not be so theatrical, Gwen. An heir to the Tran Empire must maintain a certain standard of living. Preston and Audrey cannot start their married life in a starter home. They need prestige. You are just the chief operating officer. You do not host the society dinners. You do not need 3 bedrooms. And where exactly am I supposed to live? I asked, locking eyes with my mother. Queens has lovely developing neighborhoods, Vivian suggested, without a trace of irony. You and Nathan can find a quaint little duplex. It will build character. Plus, Nathan is from the Midwest. He will appreciate the suburban feel. I looked at the 4 faces staring back at me. Audrey was already returning her attention to the fabric swatches. Preston was finishing his drink, entirely unbothered by the fact that he was stealing his sister's sanctuary. Vivian looked annoyed by the delay, and Kenneth watched me with cold, calculating eyes, waiting for my submission. I will not sign the deed, I stated, clearly, the words vibrating with every ounce of strength I had left. I bought that property with my own savings. It is not a corporate asset. It is mine. The silence that fell over the table was thick and suffocating. Audrey froze. Preston lowered his glass. Vivian gasped softly, clutching her pearl necklace. No one ever told Kenneth Tran no. Kenneth leaned forward, the polished veneer dropping to reveal the ruthless dictator beneath. Your savings exist because I hired you. Your title exists because I allow it. Everything you are is a product of my company. I earned my title. I countered, my jaw tight. I closed Hudson Yards. I fixed the escrow disaster Preston created. Kenneth slammed his hand flat against the table. The crystal glasses rattled. You will sign the paperwork, Gwen. If you refuse, I will restructure your position by Friday. You will find yourself demoted to a junior analyst role. Your salary will be slashed by 80%. Good luck paying the property taxes on an Upper East Side penthouse on a junior analyst paycheck. You will lose the condo to foreclosure in 6 months anyway. I will ruin your career and bankrupt you before the wedding invitations are even mailed. The psychological warfare was suffocating. He was trapping me in a corner with no exits. If I fought him, he would destroy my income and force me to lose the home anyway. If I complied, I would lose my dignity and my sanctuary. The panic fluttered in my chest, a trapped bird desperate for air. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table. But screaming would only prove to Kenneth that he had won. Emotion was a currency they used against me. I needed to act like a machine. I needed to survive the night. I looked down at my hands. I thought about the encrypted spreadsheet Nathan and I had built. I thought about the routing numbers showing Preston's crypto failures. A frontal assault would fail. Kenneth had all the corporate leverage. I needed to disarm them. I needed them to drop their guard. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my shoulders to slump. I let the defiance drain from my eyes, replacing it with the hollow, defeated compliance they had expected all along. I looked up at Kenneth. My voice was soft, barely a whisper. I need a week to pack my things. Vivian smiled, a radiant, victorious expression washing over her face. Oh, Gwen, that is wonderful. I knew you would see reason. Family protects family. Audrey clapped her hands together. Thank you so much, Gwen. I promise we will invite you over for dinner once the marble is installed. Kenneth nodded, picking up his phone once again, his dominance reestablished. Our lawyers will send the trust documents on Monday. See that they are signed promptly. I spent the rest of the dinner eating in silence, allowing them to bask in their perceived victory. They thought they had broken me. They thought I had finally accepted my place as the sacrificial lamb for Preston's future. The next morning at the Tran Heritage Building, I initiated the illusion of my defeat. I requested a stack of cardboard moving boxes from the facilities department and dragged them into my executive suite. I left the door wide open. I began taking down my framed degrees, my industry awards, and the photos of Nathan and me. I wrapped them slowly in bubble wrap, ensuring everyone who walked past the corridor saw the broken chief operating officer packing away her legacy. When Preston strolled past my office on his way to a prolonged lunch, he paused in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Moving day already? Preston asked, tossing an apple in his hand. Do not worry, Gwen. I will take good care of the place. I kept my eyes focused on a stack of files. Enjoy the marble countertops, Preston. To sell the deception further, I printed out several glossy real estate brochures for corporate apartments in downtown Chicago. I left them fanned out across my mahogany desk, right next to a printed flight itinerary to O'Hare Airport. The bait was set. Within hours, the office gossip mill was churning. The whispers echoed through the break room and the elevators. Gwen Tran was stepping down. Gwen Tran had surrendered. Gwen Tran was moving to Chicago with her fiancé to escape the family business. My parents heard the rumors before noon. Kenneth sent me a brief, satisfied email commending my mature decision. They were celebrating my retreat. They stopped scrutinizing my digital footprint. They stopped watching my calendar. They believed I was neutralized, busy packing my life into cardboard boxes and searching for a quiet escape in the Midwest. They were entirely wrong. I was not packing to surrender. I was clearing the battlefield. By making them believe I was fleeing to Chicago, I bought myself the one resource I desperately needed to launch a fatal counterattack: time. While Kenneth and Preston lowered their defenses and turned their attention to wedding planners and luxury renovations, they failed to notice the storm gathering right beneath their feet. My obedience was a smokescreen. The real war was about to escalate, and the next mistake Preston made would hand me the very weapon I needed to destroy them all. The cardboard boxes scattered across my office acted as the perfect camouflage. For 3 entire days following that terrible dinner, Kenneth and Preston paraded around the executive suite with the relaxed swagger of victorious generals. Preston spent his mornings sitting in the break room, his voice echoing down the hallway as he loudly ordered imported Italian marble for my kitchen over the phone. Kenneth resumed his long afternoon lunches at the private executive club. His posture was loose, his demeanor was light. They were convinced the troublesome daughter was finally out of the way, defeated, and preparing to flee to Chicago. They grew perilously complacent. They stopped checking the internal compliance logs. They assumed my packed desk meant my eyes were closed. But my eyes were wide open, and I was watching the incoming corporate data streams with unrelenting focus. On a rainy Tuesday morning, their comfortable facade shattered. The crisis did not announce itself with a loud explosion. It arrived as a frantic, breathless phone call from the city planning commissioner directly to the CEO suite. I was sitting in my half-empty office, taping a box shut, when the shouting erupted from Kenneth's workspace. It was a guttural, visceral sound of pure panic. I stood up, walked to my glass door, and watched the chaos unfold. The Apex Tower was Tran Heritage Group's most ambitious project of the decade. It was a gleaming 70-story glass and steel monolith rising above Midtown, designed to redefine the city skyline and cement our legacy for another century. It required intricate, highly specific commercial zoning variances due to its imposing shadow footprint and subterranean transit connections. Preston, in his infinite arrogance, had ignored the mandatory environmental impact filings during his tenure as lead project manager. He wanted to speed up the timeline to impress his friends. He had approved the excavation and foundation pouring without securing the final city permits. The city inspectors had just discovered the breach. They slapped a permanent stop work order on the entire site. The financial penalties were compounding at $200,000 a day. Worse, the primary investors were threatening to pull their funding, a move that would trigger a catastrophic cascade of defaults across our entire real estate portfolio. Kenneth, Vivian, and Preston scrambled into the central boardroom, drawing the privacy blinds shut. I lingered near the corridor, keeping my head down while holding a stack of dummy files to look busy. Through the thin gap in the glass panels, I could hear Preston hyperventilating. "What are we going to do?" Preston stammered. His voice cracked under the suffocating pressure. "The investors are going to pull out. The city is threatening criminal negligence charges. If Grandpa Vincent finds out about this, he will strip my inheritance. He will throw me out on the street." Vivian paced the length of the room. Her expensive heels clicked rapidly against the hardwood floor. "Calm down, Preston. We just need to control the narrative. We need to present a solution to the board before Vincent ever sees the city inspection reports." Kenneth stood at the head of the table. His face was a mask of grim, desperate calculation. He looked at his weeping son, then at his wife, and the gears of his self-preservation began to turn. "We do not need a solution, Vivian," Kenneth said. His voice dropped into a dark, conspiratorial register. "We need a shield. We need someone who already has one foot out the door. Someone the board already believes is stepping down because they are incapable of handling the pressure." I pressed my back against the corridor wall. The cold marble seeped through my silk blouse, sending a shiver down my spine. They were not trying to fix the skyscraper. They were actively planning to frame me for its collapse. I hurried back to my office, pushing the door shut and logging into the secure executive server. If Kenneth was going to make me the scapegoat, he needed a paper trail. I refreshed the digital compliance logs, watching the activity monitor with bated breath. 10 minutes later, a highly restricted file was accessed from Kenneth's terminal. It was the Apex Tower Final Authorization Addendum. This was a document I had explicitly refused to sign 3 months ago because the environmental surveys were missing. I watched in real time as the digital ledger flickered. A new version of the addendum was uploaded to the server. I opened the file. There, at the bottom of the page, was my digital DocuSign stamp authorizing the illegal excavation. Kenneth had spoofed my credentials. He used his overarching administrative privileges to force my digital signature onto the fraudulent paperwork. But Kenneth was old school. He did not trust digital trails alone. He believed that physical evidence held an undeniable weight in a boardroom. To make the forgery airtight, he needed a tangible document. I waited until Kenneth left his suite to meet with the crisis public relations team. The executive floor was temporarily deserted. I slipped out of my office and walked briskly into his sprawling workspace. His desk was cluttered with blueprints and damage control strategies. I bypassed the mess, my eyes zeroing in on a single manila envelope sitting near his leather desk pad. I slid the documents out. It was the hard copy of the Apex Tower addendum. Next to my fake digital stamp was a physical signature. My name, written in sweeping cursive handwriting that looked almost exactly like my own. But it was not the handwriting that caught my breath. It was the ink. The signature was written in a deep, rich emerald green. Decades ago, when Tran Heritage Group secured its very first landmark development, my grandfather Vincent purchased a limited edition vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen. He had a specialty ink custom mixed in Paris, a unique emerald hue meant to symbolize prosperity and endurance. When Vincent retired from the daily operations, he gifted that pen to Kenneth. Kenneth treated it like a royal scepter. He kept it tucked in the breast pocket of his suit jacket at all times, only unscrewing the cap to sign contracts of immense historical importance. In his panicked rush to frame me, Kenneth had grabbed the nearest pen to forge my physical signature, forgetting the distinctive nature of the ink inside it. He believed a wet signature layered over a digital stamp would make the document irrefutable. Instead, he had just painted a glowing emerald bullseye on his own back. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were remarkably steady. I turned on the macro lens and positioned the camera directly over the forged signature. I took a dozen high-resolution photographs. I captured the exact shade of the green ink, the microscopic feathering of the liquid on the expensive paper, and the heavy indentations where Kenneth had pressed too hard, trying to mimic my natural cursive loops. I slid the document back into the envelope exactly as I found it. I retreated to my office, my heart hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I uploaded the photographs to the encrypted spreadsheet Nathan and I had created. The trap was set. I possessed the exact evidence needed to prove Kenneth committed corporate fraud and forgery, but the thrill of the discovery was swiftly overshadowed by a dark, suffocating wave of dread. The danger to my career was no longer a simple demotion or a stolen bonus. The city inspectors were demanding answers. The investors were preparing fierce lawsuits. If Kenneth succeeded in presenting that forged document to the board before I could spring my trap, I would not just lose my job. I would face severe criminal prosecution. I would be barred from the real estate industry forever. I would spend the rest of my life paying off city penalties for a skyscraper I did not even manage, while Preston walked away clean. My family was constructing a legal coffin, and they were preparing to nail the lid shut with me inside. I sat in my chair, staring at the cardboard moving boxes scattered around my desk. The illusion of my retreat was no longer a convenient trick. It was a ticking clock. I had the evidence, but I lacked the institutional power to wield it. If I simply went to human resources or the police, Kenneth's high-priced lawyers would bury me in litigation for decades. I had to let them corner me. I had to let them present their lies in the open. A sharp knock on my glass door shattered my racing thoughts. Kenneth's executive assistant stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Gwen," she said, her voice tight, "your father needs you in his office, right now." I looked at the assistant, then down at my trembling hands. The waiting was over. Kenneth had finished preparing the guillotine, and it was time for my execution. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, gathering every ounce of courage I had left. I was walking into the most brutal confrontation of my life, unaware of the devastating psychological warfare my parents were about to unleash to force my surrender. I crossed the threshold into the executive suite. The air conditioning felt 10 degrees colder inside Kenneth's office. He sat behind his sprawling desk. Vivian stood near the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Central Park with her arms crossed over her pristine cashmere sweater. The room smelled of fresh espresso and impending ruin. Kenneth did not offer me a seat. He simply tapped his index finger against a crisp white folder resting on his leather blotter. "Sit down, Gwen," he instructed. I took the chair opposite him, keeping my spine rigid. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain shallow and even. "We have a situation with the Apex Tower," Kenneth began, his tone remarkably calm. "It appears someone in the executive chain authorized the excavation without securing the final environmental permits. The city inspectors issued a stop work order this morning. The financial penalties are severe." I kept my face perfectly blank. "And you have called me here to fix it." Kenneth leaned forward, pushing the folder across the desk. I opened the cover. Inside lay the forged addendum I had photographed an hour earlier. My digital stamp and the emerald ink signature glared back at me. "You already fixed it," Kenneth stated. "You signed the authorization 3 months ago. You bypassed compliance to speed up the timeline." I stared at the paper. The lie was so brazen it stole the air from the room. Preston managed the Apex project. He submitted those schedules. "Preston is a visionary," Vivian chimed in, stepping away from the window. Her high heels clicked against the hardwood floor. "He oversees the broad strokes. You are the chief operating officer, Gwen. You manage the details. And you let this detail slip through the cracks." I looked at my mother. Her face held a chilling mask of maternal disappointment. "You are framing me." Kenneth sighed, a weary and practiced sound. "We are protecting the Tran heritage legacy. If the board discovers the heir to this company bungled our flagship skyscraper, the investors will panic. The stock will plummet. But if an overworked executive made an administrative error and stepped down to focus on her personal life, the markets will stabilize. We can contain the fallout." He reached into his breast pocket. My eyes tracked the movement. He pulled out the vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen, the exact weapon he used to forge my name. He placed it carefully next to the folder. "Underneath the addendum is a letter of resignation and a formal confession," Kenneth said. "It states you take full responsibility for the zoning failure due to personal stress. You will sign it right now. You will clear your desk by 5 o'clock. I felt a cold sweat break across the back of my neck. "And if I refuse to fall on my sword for Preston?" Kenneth folded his hands together. "Then I will present this addendum to the city inspectors myself. I will testify that you acted alone. I will drag you through a grueling public termination. I will ensure every real estate firm in Manhattan views you as a toxic liability. Your career will end in disgrace. Furthermore, I will invoke the morality clause in the family charter to seize your 10% minority shares." He paused, letting the threat settle in the quiet room. "You will walk away with nothing, Gwen. No job, no reputation, no equity." Vivian stepped behind my chair, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. The weight of her touch felt suffocating. "We do not want to do this to you, dear," Vivian whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "But you are forcing our hand. You have always been so rigid, so unwilling to support your brother. Preston is getting married. He is building the future of this family. Why must you always make things so difficult?" I looked up at her reflection in the glass window. I am losing my entire life so he can avoid the consequences of his own incompetence. Vivian tightened her grip on my shoulder. You are being a selfish daughter, Gwen. Real families make sacrifices for each other. We gave you an incredible career. We clothed you, educated you, and brought you into the elite circles of this city. And the moment we ask for a little loyalty, you act like a victim. It is shameful. The psychological warfare hit me with the force of a freight train. The room began to spin. For 31 years, my identity was wrapped in being a Tran. The fear of their rejection had governed every choice I ever made. The little girl inside me, the one who just wanted her parents to look at her with an ounce of pride, screamed to sign the paper. If I signed it, the conflict would end. They would not ruin me publicly. They might even say thank you. The crushing weight of guilt pressed down on my chest. Was I being selfish? Was my pride worth destroying the family empire? The manipulation was so effective, so surgically precise, that I questioned my own sanity for a fleeting, terrifying moment. I reached out my fingers, brushing the cool resin casing of the Mont Blanc pen. Kenneth watched me, a satisfied gleam forming in his eyes. He thought he had won. But as my fingers closed around the pen, a vivid flash of memory pierced the fog in my mind. The image of the champagne flutes, the decadent fondant cake, the empty, sterile hospital room where I woke up alone with tubes in my arm. They did not love me. They only loved what they could extract from me. I slowly released the pen. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the mahogany desk. I need to review the exact phrasing of the confession I said, keeping my voice raspy and defeated. I need to make sure I am protected from criminal liability. Kenneth frowned, his satisfaction souring. It is a standard internal disclosure. You will not face jail time. We have handled the legal parameters. I stood up, gripping the edge of the desk to steady my trembling legs. I am giving up my career and my equity. I need to read the fine print. I will give you my final answer at the annual board meeting on Thursday. Vivian scoffed, crossing her arms again. Thursday is unacceptable. The investors are demanding answers now. It is Thursday, or I walk out of this building and call a press conference right now, I countered. My gaze met Kenneth's. I held the eye contact until he finally blinked. Fine, Kenneth snapped. Thursday morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Do not test my patience, Gwen. You are hanging by a very thin thread. I turned and walked out of the suite. I kept my head high until the elevator doors closed. The moment I was alone in the descending metal box, my knees buckled. I sank to the floor, gasping for air as a panic attack seized my lungs. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing despair. I was losing my family. Even if they were poison, they were the only family I had ever known. The thought of being orphaned by my own parents felt like swallowing glass. I managed to navigate the busy city sidewalks, blending into the rush hour crowd like a ghost. I reached my Upper East Side apartment and unlocked the door. The space was dark and quiet. I dropped my keys on the console and slid down the wall, curling my knees to my chest. The tears finally came. Harsh, ragged sobs tore through my throat. I wept for the 12-year-old girl holding the broken architectural model. I wept for the woman fighting for her life in the emergency room. I wept for the daughter who realized she was nothing but a disposable pawn. The front door clicked open. Nathan stepped inside, carrying a folder of audit reports from his own firm. He saw me sitting on the floor in the dark. He dropped his briefcase instantly. He knelt in front of me, framing my tear-stained face with his warm hands. Gwen, look at me. Tell me what happened. I choked on my words, struggling to form a coherent sentence. They forged my signature. The Apex Tower is failing. Kenneth threatened to destroy my reputation and seize my shares if I do not sign a confession. Vivian told me I was a selfish daughter. Nathan, they are going to take everything. If I fight them, I lose my family forever. Nathan did not flinch. He did not offer empty assurances. He looked deep into my eyes, his expression fierce and unwavering. "They are not your family, Gwen," Nathan said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "Families show up when you are bleeding in a hospital bed. Families do not steal your bonus to fund a gambling habit. Families do not forge your name on illegal documents to protect a spoiled son. They are holding you hostage with a word they do not even understand the meaning of." I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against his chest. "I am so tired, Nathan. The guilt is crushing me. Maybe I should just walk away. Let them have the company. Let them have the blame." Nathan wrapped his arms around my shoulders, holding me tight. "You can walk away if you want to. I will support whatever choice you make. But remember the cold hospital room. Remember the champagne flutes on social media while you were fighting for your life. They will not stop with the confession. They will keep taking until there is nothing left of you. You have the evidence. You know their playbook. You just have to decide if you are ready to stop playing their game." His words cut through the suffocating fog of Vivian's psychological warfare. He was right. The guilt I felt was an artificial construct, a cage my parents spent 30 years building around my mind. I opened my eyes, staring into the dark hallway of my apartment. The tears stopped falling. The panic transformed into a cold, hardened resolve. I stood up, wiping the dampness from my cheeks. I am not signing their confession, and I am not running to Chicago. Nathan smiled, a slow, proud expression settling on his features. "Then what is the next move?" I looked at my watch. It was Tuesday evening. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. I had 36 hours to orchestrate a corporate execution. But Kenneth held the majority of the board in his pocket. To dismantle his power, I needed a weapon far stronger than a forensic spreadsheet. I needed the one person on Earth who possessed the legal authority to overrule my father. I grabbed my car keys from the console. I am driving to the Adirondacks. The drive north on the interstate felt like moving backward through time. The towering glass monoliths of Manhattan gradually yielded to the dense, ancient pine forests of the Adirondack Mountains. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan, my mind operating with the cold precision of a ticking clock. I was not a wounded daughter fleeing her abusers. I was a corporate operative seeking an audience with the only sovereign who held enough power to overrule the dictator. My grandfather, Vincent Tran, built the Heritage Group from a single dilapidated Bronx apartment building in the 1970s. He was a brilliant architect of wealth. At 82 years old, declining physical mobility had forced him to retreat to a sprawling lakeside estate in upstate New York, leaving Kenneth to manage the daily empire. But Vincent still held 51% of the voting shares. He was the sleeping dragon Kenneth hoped to keep sedated. The wrought iron gates of the estate parted as my vehicle approached. I drove up the winding gravel path. The main house was a masterpiece of stone and heavy timber sitting quietly against the edge of a glassy, pitch-black lake. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and wood smoke. It was a world away from the suffocating executive suites of the city. I found him in his vast library, sitting in a wingback chair by a roaring fireplace. A plaid wool blanket rested over his knees. A heavy wooden cane leaned against the armrest. He looked up from a leather-bound biography as I stepped into the room. His eyes, a piercing, unclouded brown, locked onto mine. He did not look surprised to see me. "Gwen, you look like you have not slept in a week," Vincent remarked. His voice was a gravelly baritone that still commanded immediate respect. "And you are missing the annual operating committee review." "I am staging a corporate intervention, grandfather," I replied, pulling a sleek silver tablet from my tote bag. I walked across the Persian rug and sat in the chair opposite him. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mention the lonely hospital room, the cake tasting, or Vivian and her cruel psychological manipulation. Emotion was a currency Vincent did not accept. He traded in leverage metrics and risk assessment. I spoke to him as a fellow executive. Preston lost a substantial portion of our operational reserves in an offshore digital currency scheme. I began sliding the tablet onto the small table between us. I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted spreadsheet Nathan and I had engineered. Kenneth covered the deficit by draining my executive bonus and shifting liquid assets across 3 subsidiary ledgers. The quarterly books you received last month were doctored. Vincent picked up his reading glasses from the side table. He slipped them on and peered at the glowing screen. His jaw tightened. The silence in the library stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. "That is just the financial mismanagement," I continued, my voice steady and level. "The structural crisis is far worse." I swiped the screen to the next file. The high-resolution photograph of the forged Apex Tower addendum filled the display. Preston authorized the Midtown excavation without securing the required environmental permits, I explained. The city issued a permanent stop work order today. To hide the blunder, Kenneth spoofed my digital credentials and forged my physical signature to frame me for the oversight. He gave me an ultimatum. I sign a confession by Thursday morning, or he ruins my career and seizes my equity. Vincent stared at the photograph. I zoomed in on the physical signature, highlighting the distinctive feathering of the wet ink on the thick paper. Kenneth used the vintage Mont Blanc pen you gifted him, I noted. The custom emerald green ink. Vincent removed his glasses. His hands, usually plagued by a slight age-related tremor, were rock steady. The betrayal registered in his eyes, morphing from disappointment into a cold, lethal fury. He built Tran Heritage Group on a foundation of fierce meritocracy. He despised nepotism, which was exactly why Kenneth had hidden Preston's incompetence so carefully over the years. "Kenneth is a fool," Vincent rasped. His knuckles gripped the carved wooden arms of his chair. "He thinks because my legs are failing, my mind has deteriorated alongside them." I knew the quarterly reports felt sterile. I knew the profit margins on the commercial division were artificially inflated, but I did not anticipate he would resort to outright forgery to protect that spoiled boy. Vincent reached for his heavy cane and slowly pushed himself up to a standing position. He walked toward the tall window, looking out over the dark, tranquil lake. The flames from the hearth cast long, dancing shadows across the rows of bookshelves. "Your father is not just forging zoning permits," Gwen Vincent stated. "He is currently orchestrating a legal coup." I furrowed my brow, standing up to join him near the glass. "What kind of coup?" "My private attorney called me yesterday morning." Vincent explained, his breath fogging the cold window pane. "Kenneth retained a boutique litigation firm in Manhattan. They are preparing to file an emergency competency injunction against me on Wednesday afternoon. Kenneth plans to argue that I am suffering from advanced dementia, rendering me legally unfit to execute my duties as the majority shareholder." A fresh chill swept through my veins, far colder than the mountain air outside. Kenneth was not just trying to push me out. He was planning to dethrone the founder. If the injunction succeeded, a judge would freeze Vincent's 51% voting power. Kenneth would control the annual board meeting unopposed. He would coronate Preston as the new chief executive officer and finalize my termination without a single dissenting voice. My father was burning down the entire corporate hierarchy to build a throne for his golden heir. He is going to spring the injunction right before the board convenes on Thursday, I said, the puzzle pieces snapping into a horrifying picture. He wants to catch you off guard so you cannot mount a legal defense in time. Kenneth underestimates my paranoia, Vincent murmured, turning back to face me with a sharp, predatory glint in his eye. He thinks he is playing chess, but he is merely rearranging the pawns. We are going to flip the board. Vincent walked back to his heavy oak desk, pulling a brass key from his pocket to unlock the bottom drawer. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, sealed white envelope bearing the crest of a prominent Manhattan medical research facility. He held it out to me. "Take this," Vincent instructed. "Do not open it. Keep it secure until Thursday morning. When Kenneth attempts to execute his little injunction in front of the board of directors, you will slide this envelope across the mahogany table. I will handle the rest." I took the envelope. It felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. "What do you need me to do until then?" "You need to return to the city," Vincent commanded, his eyes burning with the ruthless energy that built an empire. "Kenneth gave you until Thursday to sign that bogus confession. Use that time. He believes you are paralyzed by fear and family loyalty. Let him believe it. While he is busy polishing his crown, you are going to launch a shadow audit." "A shadow audit," I echoed. "Nathan and I already traced the crypto losses." "That is pocket change," Vincent countered, tapping his cane against the floor for emphasis. "If Kenneth is bold enough to forge environmental documents and file a fraudulent medical injunction against his own father, he is hiding a deeper systemic rot. Dig into the flagship properties. Look at the collateral agreements. Find the kill shot, Gwen. I want every single skeleton dragged out into the light by Thursday morning." I gripped the sealed envelope, feeling a profound shift in the axis of my universe. I arrived at the estate as a victim seeking refuge from an impossible ultimatum. I was leaving as a fully authorized corporate operative with the backing of the supreme shareholder. I nodded to my grandfather, sealing our silent, unbreakable pact. The drive back to the chaotic grid of New York City felt like a march to war. I had to plunge into the darkest corners of my father's financial secrets. Kenneth thought I was spending my time weeping in my apartment debating whether to sign his false confession. Instead, I was about to dissect his entire financial existence. But I was entirely unaware that the forensic shadow audit would uncover a truth so catastrophic it would elevate this family feud into an existential battle for the survival of a century-old legacy. I returned to Manhattan under the cover of darkness. The sealed envelope from Vincent rested inside my leather tote, a quiet promise of impending retribution. I did not go to my apartment. I drove straight to the Tran Heritage Building. The overnight security guard offered a sympathetic nod, accustomed to seeing the exhausted executive working ungodly hours. I told him I was finalizing my transition paperwork and packing my remaining files. It was a plausible excuse. I bypassed the glamorous executive suite on the 52nd floor. Instead, I took the service elevator down to the sub-basement. The archival records room was a windowless concrete bunker, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes and smelling faintly of ozone and dusty paper. It housed the localized backup servers and decades of physical property deeds. It was the one room in the entire skyscraper unmonitored by Kenneth and his loyal security director. Nathan arrived 20 minutes later, slipping through the loading dock entrance. He carried a heavy canvas backpack loaded with his proprietary forensic auditing hardware. We arranged 2 metal folding chairs in front of a battered steel desk. He connected his secure terminal to the mainframe, bypassing the internal firewalls with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned investigator. We had 32 hours until the annual board meeting. While we sat in that suffocating basement, breathing recycled air, my family was putting on a spectacle. Miles away, inside the vaulted ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, Kenneth and Vivian hosted a lavish pre-coronation cocktail party. They invited the most influential stakeholders, prominent city officials, and high society elites. They spared no expense serving beluga caviar on sterling silver trays and pouring vintage champagne that cost more than a junior analyst earned in a year. Kenneth wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, projecting the image of a triumphant sovereign preparing to pass the torch. Preston stood by his side, his hair perfectly coiffed, shaking hands and offering wide, practiced smiles. Vivian circulated through the ballroom in a sweeping silk gown, weaving a tragic but heroic narrative for anyone who would listen. She whispered to the wealthy patrons that her daughter was stepping down due to severe personal stress, framing my impending exit as a necessary sacrifice for my fragile health. They toasted to their own brilliance, clinking crystal flutes under glowing chandeliers, thoroughly convinced that the troublesome daughter was currently weeping in her apartment and drafting a letter of surrender. They believed I was a casualty of their ambition. They did not realize I was the architect of their ruin. In the cold sub-basement, Nathan's fingers flew across his illuminated keyboard. Lines of dense financial code cascaded down his monitors. We were no longer looking at the stolen executive bonus or the petty consulting fees routed to Preston over the years. We were hunting for the systemic rot Vincent had warned me about. The offshore crypto losses were staggering, but as Nathan peeled back the layers of the corporate ledger, the math refused to balance. Preston had not just lost a few $1,000,000 in operational liquidity. The deficit was a gaping, catastrophic crater. "Gwen, look at this routing pathway," Nathan murmured, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He pointed a pen at a series of transactions buried within a subsidiary holding account. Kenneth did not just shift liquid cash to cover the crypto collapse. There was not enough cash available. He needed a rapid injection of capital to prevent the entire corporate structure from defaulting last quarter. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes tracing the complex web of shell companies Kenneth had established in the Cayman Islands. Where did he get the capital to plug a hole that large? Nathan executed a series of keystrokes, pulling up a hidden directory of encrypted legal contracts. He opened the first file. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a uniform commercial code financing statement, a sweeping high-interest collateral agreement tied to a shadow lender known for predatory corporate loans. But it was not the interest rate that made my blood run cold. It was the collateral listed on the final page of the document. Kenneth had leveraged the Fifth Avenue Retail Pavilion. The pavilion was the crown jewel of our retail division, generating reliable 8-figure revenues for 3 consecutive decades. It was a cornerstone asset. But Nathan did not stop there. He opened a second file, then a third, then a fourth. Kenneth had mortgaged the Soho commercial blocks. He had borrowed against the Tribeca residential towers. He had quietly placed liens on our most iconic historical properties, the very buildings my grandfather had acquired to build this empire. My father had taken the entire legacy, everything Tran Heritage Group stood for, and offered it up as collateral to secure secret loans. He used the cash to quietly erase the catastrophic debts generated by Preston and his reckless gambling. I sank back into the cold metal folding chair, the sheer scale of the betrayal washing over me like a tidal wave. Kenneth was not protecting the company by hiding Preston from the board. He was actively destroying the company from the inside out. "Pull up the repayment schedules on these shadow loans," I instructed, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet bunker. Nathan ran the calculation, his face turning pale in the blue light of the monitors. The loans are structured with brutal balloon payments. The first major default trigger hits in exactly 30 days. I stared at the numbers, the horrifying reality snapping into razor-sharp focus. If Kenneth succeeded in his legal coup on Thursday morning, He would coronate Preston as the new chief executive officer. Preston possessed zero financial acumen. He lacked the basic competence required to manage a single lease, let alone untangle a labyrinth of predatory shadow debt. If Preston takes the helm, he will miss the balloon payment next month. I said the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. And the moment he misses that payment, the creditors will execute the liens. They will seize the Fifth Avenue Pavilion. They will take the Soho blocks. The entire Tran Heritage portfolio will be liquidated. The 100-year-old real estate empire would evaporate. Thousands of employees would lose their livelihoods. The legacy my grandfather built from a crumbling Bronx apartment building would be carved up and sold for scrap by ruthless corporate vultures. All because Kenneth refused to admit his golden son was a catastrophic failure. The stakes had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a personal family feud over a stolen bonus or a forged signature on a zoning permit. This was an existential crisis. The resentment and the lingering childhood guilt I harbored toward my parents vanished, replaced by a cold, searing executive mandate. Kenneth was a traitor to his own legacy. He had transformed from a toxic father into an active, lethal threat to the survival of the enterprise. I looked at the screen, visualizing the faces of the people currently dancing in the Pierre Hotel ballroom. They were celebrating a coronation wholly blind to the fact that they were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. Print everything I told Nathan, pushing myself up from the chair. Every routing number, every hidden lien, every signature Kenneth tried to bury. Nathan routed the files to the secure local printer in the corner of the room. The machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable, devastating proof. "Are you ready for this?" Gwen Nathan asked quietly, stacking the warm papers into neat, organized piles. "Once you show this to the board, there is no going back. Kenneth will face federal charges for corporate fraud. Preston will be bankrupted. Your family will be ruined." I gathered the documents, placing them carefully into my manila folders alongside the photographs of the emerald ink forgery and the sealed medical envelope from Vincent. They ceased being my family the moment they decided my life was worth less than a slice of fondant cake, I replied, zipping my leather tote bag shut. I am not going to let them burn down a century of hard work to warm their own egos. I have to destroy my father to save this company. We packed the equipment in silence, slipping out of the sub-basement and back into the cool night air of the city. The trap was fully loaded, armed with enough explosive truth to obliterate Kenneth's reign. But my prolonged silence had not gone unnoticed by the architects of my suffering. Up in the penthouse suites of the city, Vivian and Audrey grew restless. They realized my deadline was approaching and I had not yet submitted the signed confession. Sensing my hesitation, they decided to escalate their psychological warfare. If they could not force my compliance behind closed doors, they would drag my name through the mud in the bright, unforgiving spotlight of New York high society. I braced myself for the morning, unaware of the vicious public assault they were preparing to launch to break my spirit before the board ever convened. Wednesday morning broke over the Manhattan skyline with a gray, unforgiving chill. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment. Only 24 hours remained until the annual board meeting. I had not submitted the forged confession. My continued silence signaled defiance, and Vivian Tran despised defiance. If she could not force my compliance behind the closed doors of the executive suite, she would drag my reputation through the mud in the blinding light of public opinion. Audrey possessed a vast network of socialite friends who treated high society gossip like a competitive blood sport. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the elite digital newsletters and exclusive society pages began buzzing with a coordinated surgical strike. It started as a blind item on a prominent, wealthy lifestyle blog, then swiftly morphed into a direct named hit piece, circulated across every influential inbox in the city. The headlines were crafted to inflict maximum humiliation. They did not attack my professional competence directly. Instead, they attacked my character, utilizing the oldest and most effective weapons against a successful woman. They painted me as a bitter, jealous spinster. The narrative, clearly leaked by Audrey and polished by Vivian, claimed I was suffering a severe mental breakdown, unable to handle the pressures of the corporate suite. The articles insinuated that my recent medical emergency was actually a psychological collapse brought on by crippling envy over my younger brother securing his perfect marriage. I sat at my kitchen island, scrolling through the vicious paragraphs. The digital text blurred as my pulse pounded in my ears. They framed my refusal to gift Preston my condominium as an act of petty, vindictive greed. They described me as a lonely, isolated woman trying to sabotage her golden sibling out of pure spite. The impact within the insular world of New York real estate elite was instantaneous. High society operates on an unspoken currency of association, and my stock crashed before noon. The notifications on my phone, usually a steady stream of corporate updates and networking requests, turned into a digital firing squad. An email arrived from the Metropolitan Charitable Foundation, where I had served as a dedicated board member for 6 years. The chairwoman, a woman who had previously praised my fundraising efforts, informed me that my presence at their upcoming spring gala was no longer required. Her wording was cold and precise, citing a sudden need for positive public relations and suggesting I take time to focus on my personal healing. Desperate for a voice of reason, I picked up my phone and dialed Valerie. Valerie was a seasoned commercial real estate titan who had mentored me since I was a junior analyst. She knew my work ethic. She knew Kenneth's tyrannical tendencies. I needed her advice. I needed a friendly harbor in the sudden storm. The call went straight to voicemail. 5 minutes later, a text message illuminated my screen. It was from Valerie. The message was brief and chilling. It read, "Gwen, the optics right now are impossible. I cannot be associated with this family drama. Take a leave of absence. Seek professional help. Do not contact me until the dust settles." The isolation felt physical, like a heavy weighted blanket pressing down on my chest. My parents were systematically burning my bridges, leaving me stranded on an island of their own design. They were cutting off my air supply, hoping I would suffocate and surrender before Thursday morning. The adrenaline from the late-night forensic audit evaporated. The cold, calculating executive vanished, replaced by the wounded daughter who just wanted to be loved. I sank onto the edge of my living room sofa, the glossy screens of my devices staring back at me with silent judgment. The imposter syndrome, a demon I had fought my entire career, crawled out from the dark corners of my mind. The psychological conditioning Vivian had instilled in me since childhood took hold. What if they were right? What if I was just a rigid, unlovable workaholic, destroying my family out of spite? Was my refusal to hand over my home really just an act of petty jealousy? The grief of losing my mother hit me with crushing force. I was mourning a relationship that never truly existed. I was grieving the illusion of maternal warmth, a fantasy I had chased for 31 years. The realization that Vivian would rather destroy my life than admit her son was a failure shattered the last remaining fragments of my childhood innocence. I buried my face in my hands. The tears fell hot and fast, slipping through my fingers and staining the fabric of my trousers. I wept for the sheer, unfair cruelty of it all. Nathan walked into the living room carrying 2 mugs of fresh coffee. He stopped in his tracks, taking in my shattered posture and the glowing tablet displaying the vicious society articles. He set the mugs on the coffee table with a soft clink and sat beside me on the sofa. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer hollow platitudes. "Is saving the company worth this?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of the sorrow. If I go into that boardroom tomorrow and expose Kenneth, I am crossing a point of no return. I will be orphaned by my own parents. They are already erasing me from their world. Every friend, every mentor, every connection I have built is turning their back on me. Maybe I should just let them have the throne. Maybe I should just sign the confession and disappear. Nathan wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest. He let me cry, his steady heartbeat providing the only rhythm in my chaotic world. When my breathing finally slowed, he pulled back just enough to look me directly in the eyes. His gaze was fierce and unwavering. "Gwen, they are not your family," Nathan said, his voice a steady, grounding force that cut through the fog of my despair. "Family shows up. Family stands by your hospital bed when you are fighting for your life. Family protects you when you are vulnerable. Your parents are just biological acquaintances who view you as an obstacle. You cannot lose something you never had." His words pierced the illusion I had clung to for 3 decades. The truth resonated deep within my bones. Vivian and Kenneth had never loved me. They loved my utility. And the moment my utility ceased to serve Preston, I became disposable. The sorrow evaporated, leaving behind a pure, crystallized resolve. The tears stopped. I was done playing the victim in their manufactured tragedy. I wiped my face, feeling the familiar fire reignite in my chest. I picked up the tablet, staring at the rescinded gala invitation from the charitable foundation. "You are right," I stated, my voice finding its usual sharp edge. "I have spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table where the game was rigged against me from the start." I stood up from the sofa, the exhaustion replaced by a dangerous electric energy. I looked down at the screen, noting the time and location of the spring gala scheduled for that very evening. "I am done playing defense," I declared, tossing the tablet onto the cushion. "They want to paint me as a broken spinster hiding in the shadows. They expect me to cower in this apartment while they toast to my demise. I am going to show them exactly what a chief operating officer looks like." I turned and walked toward my closet. Vivian and Kenneth would undoubtedly be at that charity event, holding court, accepting the sympathetic whispers of the elite crowd. They assumed their smear campaign had successfully locked me away. But I was not going to hide. I was going to crash their pristine party, unaware that forcing a public confrontation would push my parents to drop their refined masks and reveal the true depth of their venom. I pulled a midnight blue silk gown from the depths of my closet. It was a garment I usually reserved for triumphant acquisitions and closing dinners. Tonight, it would serve as my armor. The fabric draped seamlessly over my frame, a stark contrast to the pale exhaustion that had haunted my reflection just hours earlier. I applied a crimson lipstick, a bold declaration of presence, and clasped a simple diamond pendant around my neck. Nathan stood in the doorway of our bedroom, leaning against the frame with a quiet, steady pride in his eyes. He handed me a sleek silver clutch and offered a soft, reassuring nod. He knew I had to face this particular battle alone. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel glowed with the warm, opulent light of cascading crystal chandeliers. This was the epicenter of New York real estate philanthropy. The air hummed with the sophisticated chatter of billionaires, politicians, and socialites. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided across the marble floors, carrying trays of sparkling champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. I surrendered my coat to the attendant and smoothed the front of my gown. My invitation had been formally revoked that morning by the chairwoman, but I knew the security staff. I had spent 6 years managing the logistical endowments for this exact venue. The head of security recognized me, offering a polite dip of his chin, and parted the velvet ropes without asking for a printed ticket. I stepped into the grand hall. The impact of my arrival rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into a still pond. The sophisticated chatter faltered. Eyes darted in my direction. Whispers ignited behind manicured hands and crystal flutes. I walked toward the center of the room with slow, deliberate steps. The elite patrons of Manhattan high society, people I had negotiated with and raised funds alongside for years, suddenly found reasons to turn their backs. A prominent property developer who had recently praised my Hudson Yards victory refused to meet my gaze, suddenly fascinated by a floral arrangement. The social exile was palpable, a heavy, suffocating, invisible weight pressing against my shoulders. Vivian Tran spent decades cultivating this exact type of psychological control. She wielded social standing like a scalpel, isolating anyone who dared to defy the family narrative. She assumed the silent judgment of the ballroom would crush my spirit and force a hasty, shameful retreat. I felt a brief, familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest, the remnant of a frightened child seeking approval. But the fear evaporated, replaced by the hardened resolve of an executive who held the keys to their destruction. I requested a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and took a slow sip, maintaining a serene, unbothered posture. Across the room, standing near an ice sculpture carved to resemble the Manhattan skyline, my parents noticed the disturbance. Vivian froze mid-sentence, her pristine smile fractured into a brittle, rigid line. Kenneth turned his head, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. Audrey stood beside them, her hand flying to her mouth in genuine horror at my audacity. I raised my glass to them in a silent, mocking toast. Kenneth murmured something sharp to Vivian. He set his drink on a nearby table and began moving through the crowd, charting a deliberate path toward a set of heavy mahogany doors situated at the far end of the hall. Those doors led to the private donor lounges, insulated rooms designed for discreet negotiations away from the prying eyes of the press. Vivian followed close behind him, her silk gown trailing over the polished floor. Kenneth caught my eye and tipped his head toward the corridor, a silent, non-negotiable command to follow. I set my glass down and navigated through the parting sea of onlookers. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the dim, quiet space of the VIP lounge. The thick Persian carpets absorbed the sound of my heels. The heavy velvet curtains muted the jazz music from the ballroom into a dull, distant throb. Kenneth and Vivian stood waiting in the center of the room. The polished socialite facades they wore so carefully in the ballroom vanished the instant the heavy doors clicked shut behind me. Their refined elegance peeled away, revealing the raw, ugly desperation underneath. "What kind of stunt is this?" Kenneth demanded, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You are trespassing, Gwen. You are embarrassing this family in front of the most important investors in the city." "I am simply attending a charity event I helped organize," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. Vivian stepped forward, her face flushed with unadulterated venom. "Do not play games with us. You know exactly what you are doing. You are trying to humiliate your brother. You are parading yourself around in that dress, playing the tragic victim while you plot to ruin his wedding. You have always been so bitter, so incapable of letting anyone else shine." The cruelty in her words was designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. In the past, a barrage like this would have reduced me to apologies and tears. I would have scrambled to prove my loyalty, begging for a scrap of her maternal affection. But standing in that quiet room, Looking at the woman who had dismissed my brush with death to taste cake, I felt nothing but a profound, empty clarity. "I am not here for Preston," I stated calmly. "I am here because I refuse to hide in my apartment while you peddle lies to the press." Kenneth stepped closer, invading my personal space in a blatant attempt to intimidate me. "The deadline is tomorrow morning, Gwen. You will sign the confession. You will resign. You will hand over the keys to that condominium. If you do not submit the paperwork by 8 o'clock, I will ensure the city prosecutors receive your forged digital signature before noon." Vivian moved to stand beside him, presenting a united, unbreakable front. "And if you force us to take that path, we are done with you. We will erase you from the family tree. You will no longer be a Tran. We will strike your name from the historical charter." She paused, letting her eyes rake over me with chilling disdain. "And do not think we will attend your little wedding to that auditor. We will boycott the ceremony. We will ensure none of our extended relatives or business associates attend. You will walk down the aisle alone. You will be a pariah, a disgraced orphan." The silence stretched between us. They waited for the threat to land. They waited for the inevitable collapse, expecting me to shatter under the weight of their ultimate punishment. The threat of disownment was the nuclear option, the heaviest weapon in the Tran family arsenal. For 31 years, the fear of losing their approval had governed my every waking moment. I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my peace of mind to earn my place in their kingdom. But as I looked into my mother's cold eyes, a miraculous shift occurred within my mind. The heavy, psychological chains that had bound me to their approval rusted and snapped. The terrifying prospect of being cast out of the family vanished. It did not feel like an execution. It felt like a pardon. The threat of disownment was no longer a weapon. It was a liberation. I did not need to emancipate myself from their control. They were handing me the key to my own freedom. I felt a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. The reaction confused them. Kenneth frowned, the confidence wavering in his eyes. Vivian stepped back, uncertain how to process my lack of fear. "You cannot erase me, Vivian," I said, my voice steady and ringing with quiet, undeniable authority. "You cannot threaten to take away a love that never existed. You cannot punish me with isolation when you have left me alone my entire life." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, delivering the final verdict on our relationship. "You cannot disown someone you abandoned a long time ago." Kenneth stared at me, his jaw clenched, unable to formulate a counterattack against a woman who no longer feared him. I turned my back on them. I reached for the brass handle of the heavy mahogany door. I did not look over my shoulder. I pushed the door open and walked out of the VIP lounge, leaving my parents speechless and trapped in the suffocating silence of their own making. I navigated through the grand ballroom with my head held high. The whispers of the elite crowd no longer sounded like condemnation. They sounded like the rustling leaves of a dying season. I retrieved my coat from the attendant and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The city lights sparkled against the wet pavement. I inhaled a deep lungful of oxygen, tasting the sweet, undeniable flavor of independence. The psychological warfare was over. My soul was intact. Now only the corporate execution remained. I returned to my apartment to find the shadow audit files waiting on my desk, ready to be weaponized. I was prepared to walk into the boardroom the next morning and obliterate the very foundation of their empire, unaware of the desperate final moves my father would attempt to make before the gavel fell. The air inside my apartment felt different when I returned from the Pierre Hotel. It was no longer a sanctuary for a wounded daughter hiding from her family. It had transformed into a war room. I slipped the midnight blue silk gown off my shoulders, replacing the gala attire with comfortable sweatpants and a thick woolen sweater. The superficial battles of high society were behind me. The real war, the corporate execution, commenced at sunrise. Nathan sat at our sprawling oak dining table. The surface was buried beneath neat, precise stacks of financial documents. The glow of his dual monitors cast sharp shadows across his face. He had spent the last several hours finalizing the shadow audit, cross-referencing every hidden ledger, and securing the digital paper trail. I pulled up a chair beside him, resting my hands on the cool, polished wood. We reviewed the arsenal one final time. The evidence was impenetrable. On the far left of the table sat the high-resolution photographs of the Apex Tower addendum. Blown up and printed on glossy paper, the distinct feathering of the custom emerald green ink screamed forgery. Beside those images lay the digital footprint analysis. Nathan had isolated the IP address Kenneth used to spoof my DocuSign credentials. It traced directly back to Kenneth's private terminal in the executive suite. In the center of the table lay the financial ruin. A thick stack of wire transfer receipts documented the steady, unauthorized bleed of Tran-Heritage operational capital into a labyrinth of Cayman Island holding trusts. The routing numbers matched Preston's offshore crypto accounts digit for digit. But the most devastating weapon sat on the far right. The uniform commercial code financing statements, the predatory shadow loans. We had untangled the complex web of cross-collateralization Kenneth had spun to hide the deficit. He had signed away the deeds to the Fifth Avenue Retail Pavilion and the Soho commercial blocks. The balloon payments were scheduled to detonate in 30 days. "We have everything," Nathan said, his voice low and steady. "It is airtight. Any independent auditor or federal investigator would look at this and instantly file indictments." I traced the edge of the paper detailing the Fifth Avenue lien. My grandfather spent 10 years acquiring that property block by block, and Kenneth traded it away to protect a boy who cares more about ski trips than profit margins. The digital chime of my phone interrupted the quiet hum of the apartment. I picked up the device. The screen illuminated the darkened room. It was 1:45 in the morning. A new email had arrived in my secure corporate inbox. The sender was Kenneth Tran. He had not waited until morning. The humiliating sting of my defiance in the VIP lounge had clearly driven him to his keyboard. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the harsh clinical text. "Gwen," the email began, stripped of any familial warmth. "Your theatrical stunt at the charity gala tonight confirmed my worst fears regarding your mental stability. You are unfit to serve this company. I am offering you one final courtesy before I take decisive action. Attached is the formal resignation letter and the confession regarding the Apex Tower zoning failure. You will print these documents, sign them, and place them on my desk by 8 o'clock this morning. If your signature is missing when the annual board meeting commences at 9, I will hand the forged addendum directly to the district attorney. Furthermore, I will file a civil suit against your fiancé, citing his unauthorized access to our corporate network, and ensure his auditing license is permanently revoked. Do not test my resolve. Sign the papers." I read the words twice, letting the cold reality wash over me. Kenneth was no longer bluffing. He was threatening to send me to prison and destroy the man I loved. He believed he held the ultimate trump card. He believed his position as acting chief executive officer made him untouchable. "He is threatening my license," Nathan observed, reading the screen over my shoulder. A quiet, dangerous laugh escaped his lips. "He is terrified, Gwen. Only terrified men make threats they cannot legally enforce." I set the phone down on the table. The intimidation tactics that once paralyzed me now felt hollow, like a desperate magic trick exposed in the harsh light of day. I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, chilling calm. The daughter who craved Kenneth's approval was dead, replaced by the executive who would dismantle his reign. I opened the reply window on my phone. I did not draft a long emotional defense. I did not beg for mercy or try to reason with a dictator. I typed 2 sentences, striking the keys with deliberate, rhythmic precision. "Bring your lawyers," I typed. "I am bringing the receipts." I hit send. The message vanished into the digital ether, an irrevocable declaration of war. There was no turning back. I spent the next hour packing my leather briefcase. The ritual felt sacred, a methodical preparation for the most important presentation of my life. I slid my laptop into the padded sleeve. I gathered the printed stacks of evidence, placing them into crisp, unlabeled manila folders. The emerald ink photos, the offshore routing numbers, the predatory collateral agreements. Each folder represented a nail in Kenneth's corporate coffin. Finally, I retrieved the thick, sealed envelope my grandfather Vincent had given me in the Adirondacks. The crest of the Manhattan Medical Research Facility felt heavy in my hands. This was the shield that would deflect Kenneth's legal coup. I slipped the envelope into the center compartment of the briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, satisfying click. I managed a few hours of fitful sleep, waking before the dawn broke over the East River. The sky was a bruised, steely gray, threatening rain. I stood in front of my closet, selecting my attire with the same calculated precision a soldier uses to don their armor. I chose a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and pointed black heels. I pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek knot. My reflection in the mirror stared back with cold, unfamiliar intensity. Nathan stood by the front door, holding my trench coat and the heavy leather briefcase. He helped me into the coat, his hands lingering on my shoulders. "End it today," Nathan said, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "Burn it down and build something better." "I will see you on the other side," I promised, taking the briefcase from his grip. The cab ride to the financial district passed in a blur of wet asphalt and flashing brake lights. The city was waking up, a relentless machine of commerce and ambition. I stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of the Tran Heritage Building. The soaring glass facade reflected the turbulent sky. I walked through the revolving doors, my heels clicking a steady, authoritative rhythm across the expansive marble lobby. I bypassed my own office on the 52nd floor. I did not need to check my emails. I did not need to review the quarterly projections. I walked straight down the long carpeted corridor toward the executive boardroom. The double mahogany doors stood open. The room buzzed with the low, muted hum of high-stakes conversation. The annual Board of Directors meeting was the most pivotal gathering of the fiscal year. The long, rectangular table was flanked by the most powerful stakeholders in the firm: wealthy investors, senior legal counsel, and veteran property developers settled into their plush leather chairs, sipping black coffee and reviewing their briefing packets. I stepped over the threshold. The tension in the air was thick, carrying a sharp, metallic edge. Kenneth sat at the head of the table, his posture radiating smug, unearned triumph. He wore a dark pinstripe suit, the vintage Mont Blanc pen resting securely in his breast pocket. Preston sat to his immediate right, trying to look attentive, though his eyes betrayed a jittery, anxious energy. Vivian occupied a seat in the gallery section behind them, her posture immaculate, playing the role of the supportive matriarch. They saw me walk into the room. Kenneth's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He had expected me to arrive broken, clutching a signed resignation letter, or perhaps not arrive at all. He did not expect the icy, unyielding confidence radiating from my every step. I took my designated seat near the center of the table, placing my heavy leather briefcase squarely on the polished wood. I unclasped the brass locks. Vivian leaned forward from the gallery, her expensive perfume wafting over my shoulder. Her breath smelled of mint and desperation. She leaned close to my ear, her voice a toxic, silken whisper. "Family protects family, Gwen," she murmured, delivering the opening line of my nightmare. I did not blink. I did not turn my head. I simply looked down at the manila folder under my palms, feeling the rigid edges of the paper inside. The narrative loop closed, snapping perfectly into place. The players were assembled. The trap was armed. The gavel struck the wooden block, silencing the room, and the apocalyptic finale of Tran Heritage Group officially began. The sharp crack of the wooden gavel echoed across the sprawling mahogany table. The annual gathering of the Tran Heritage Group directors officially commenced. Rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the spectacular view of the Hudson River. Inside the climate-controlled space, the atmosphere carried a thick electric charge. 15 prominent stakeholders, including senior equity partners and veteran legal advisors, settled into their high-backed leather chairs. Kenneth stood at the head of the table. He adjusted the lapels of his dark pinstripe suit, projecting the seasoned gravity of a commander preparing to dictate the future. Preston sat to his immediate right, tapping a gold pen against his notepad. His knee bounced with a restless, jittery energy. From the gallery section behind them, Vivian observed the proceedings with the serene, unblinking focus of a predator watching a snare pull tight. I remained seated near the center of the array, my hands resting lightly on the surface of my leather briefcase. Kenneth cleared his throat. The low hum of elite conversation died instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kenneth began his baritone voice, calibrated to convey profound wisdom and steady leadership. "We stand at a pivotal juncture in the history of Manhattan real estate. For decades, I have steered this enterprise through volatile markets, financial recessions, and unprecedented urban expansion. We have built a formidable portfolio. But to maintain our dominance in a rapidly evolving digital landscape, we must embrace a new generation of leadership." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces of the investors. "Effective immediately, I am announcing my formal retirement as acting chief executive officer," Kenneth declared. A murmur rippled through the room. Senior partners exchanged calculating glances. Kenneth raised a hand to restore order. "I will retain my seat on the board, but the daily operations require fresh vision," he continued, gesturing toward the tan, sun-kissed man sitting beside him. "I am nominating my son Preston to assume the mantle of CEO. He understands the modern market. He represents the future of our investments." Preston puffed out his chest, attempting to arrange his features into a mask of stoic competence. The effort looked strained. The chief equity partner, a sharp-eyed man sitting across from me, leaned forward and steepled his fingers. "Kenneth, with all due respect to your son, this transition requires the explicit approval of the majority shareholder. Vincent holds 51% of the voting power. He is not present. We cannot ratify this transition without his proxy." Kenneth offered a tight, melancholic smile. It was a masterful performance, a display of feigned sorrow polished to perfection. He lowered his gaze to the polished wood. "That brings me to a deeply painful family matter," Kenneth said, his voice dropping to a somber, reluctant register. "My father, the founder of this great company, has suffered a rapid and severe decline in his health over the past several months. His mind is failing him. He is battling advanced dementia. Gasps of genuine surprise echoed from the veteran board members who had known my grandfather for decades. Vivian dabbed at the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief, playing her part flawlessly. It breaks my heart to speak these words. Kenneth pressed on, laying the deception on thick. But as fiduciaries, we must prioritize the stability of the firm over our personal grief. My father is no longer capable of understanding complex financial realities. His judgment is compromised. Kenneth signaled the corporate secretary standing near the projector screen. The secretary began distributing thick stacks of legal documents to every member of the board. Therefore, acting as his primary caretaker and next of kin, I filed a petition with the state Supreme Court. Kenneth explained, his tone shifting from morning sun to ruthless tactician. At 7 o'clock this morning, a judge signed an emergency competency injunction. My father is officially deemed unfit to execute his corporate duties. His voting rights are suspended pending a full medical review. As his legal proxy, I cast his 51% in favor of Preston. The trap snapped shut. Kenneth had orchestrated a flawless legal decapitation of the founder. The board members flipped through the court filings, absorbing the dense legal terminology. The injunction looked impenetrable. Kenneth stared down the length of the table, his eyes locking onto mine with an icy, triumphant glare. He believed he had won. He believed I was trapped, holding nothing but a forged confession I was too cowardly to sign. I did not flinch. I kept my breathing even, watching the seconds tick away on the digital wall clock. Before the chief equity partner could call for a formal vote, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the corridor outside. Thump, step, thump, step. The sound grew louder, piercing the stunned silence of the room. The double mahogany doors did not simply open. They were pushed apart with a slow, undeniable force. Vincent Tran stepped over the threshold. He wore a tailored charcoal three-piece suit. Both hands rested upon the polished silver handle of his heavy wooden cane. He did not look like a frail man battling dementia. He radiated a fierce, terrifying authority, carrying the commanding presence of a sovereign returning to reclaim a stolen throne. The air in the room seemed to shift, drawn toward his gravitational pull. Kenneth shot out of his chair, the color draining from his face. His carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the panicked usurper underneath. Dad. Kenneth stammered, stepping away from the podium. You should not be here. The doctor said you need to rest. We are handling the transition. Vincent ignored his son entirely. He walked toward the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, his cane striking the floorboards like a judge pounding a gavel. The board members sat in stunned, breathless silence, watching the legendary founder reclaim his physical space. Vincent settled into the leather chair, resting his hands on the armrests. He turned his piercing brown eyes toward the podium. I was unaware my transition required your handling, Vincent rasped, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a straight razor. Kenneth swallowed hard, forcing a patronizing, gentle tone. Dad, please. The court issued an injunction this morning. You are confused. Your memory is failing. You do not have the legal authority to participate in this vote. The smug confidence returned to Kenneth's features. He tapped the stack of legal filings resting on the podium. The paperwork is finalized, he insisted. You have no power here today. This was my cue. I unclasped the brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. I reached into the center compartment and retrieved the thick, sealed white envelope bearing the crest of the Manhattan Medical Research Facility. I stood up from my chair. I slid the envelope across the smooth mahogany surface. It glided effortlessly, coming to a halt directly in front of the lead corporate counsel. Kenneth furrowed his brow, staring at the pristine white paper. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice pitching higher. "Gwen, sit down. You have no authorization to submit documents." "Read it," I instructed the lead counsel, ignoring my father completely. The counsel broke the wax seal, extracting a thick sheaf of medical records. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense clinical paragraphs. As he read the findings, his posture straightened. He looked up, his expression a mixture of profound shock and undeniable clarity. "This is a comprehensive neurological evaluation," the counsel announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It was conducted 48 hours ago by the chief of neurology at Mount Sinai Hospital." Kenneth gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "That is impossible." The report details an exhaustive battery of cognitive stress tests, spatial reasoning exams, and executive function analytics. The counsel continued, reading directly from the physician's summary. "The findings are conclusive. Vincent Tran operates in the 99th percentile for cognitive function regarding his age demographic. He exhibits 0 markers of dementia, memory loss, or mental decline. He is certified in perfect psychological health." The counsel set the papers down, looking directly at my father. "The emergency injunction is based on fraudulent claims, Kenneth. It is legally void. The court order evaporated into worthless dust. The entire foundation of Kenneth's coup disintegrated in a matter of seconds." The board members began murmuring in harsh, agitated tones, realizing they had nearly been manipulated into a hostile, illegal takeover. Vivian sank back into her gallery chair, her pristine posture crumbling as the reality of their defeat washed over her. Preston stared at the table, his jaw slack, the gold pen slipping from his trembling fingers. Vincent leaned forward, folding his hands over the silver handle of his cane. He looked at Kenneth with an expression devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the look of a founder evaluating a defective asset. "You assumed my silence was a symptom of decay," Vincent stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding power. "You assumed you could steal my legacy in the dark. But I have been watching you, Kenneth, and I have already chosen a successor." Vincent turned his head, his sharp brown eyes meeting mine down the length of the long table. "And she is the only one in this family with a spine," he declared. He struck his cane against the floorboard, finalizing the decree. "I officially name Gwen Tran the Chief Executive Officer of this enterprise, effective immediately." The boardroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices and frantic murmurs. I remained perfectly still, absorbing the immense weight of the title. The golden heir had been sidelined. The dictator had been stripped of his crown. But Kenneth was not a man who surrendered gracefully. Like a cornered predator, he realized his grand strategy had failed, forcing him to pivot to his most desperate, destructive backup plan. He reached into his breast pocket, his fingers wrapping around the vintage Mont Blanc pen, preparing to unleash the forged documents and drag me down into the ruins of his shattered coup. The room erupted into a deafening cacophony. Decorum vanished into the humid air. Senior partners shouted over one another, demanding immediate clarity from the head of the table. Kenneth's face turned a mottled, furious crimson. His grand strategy had shattered against the weight of Vincent's medical evaluation. But a desperate man remains a dangerous adversary. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, the sharp impact silencing the chaotic uproar. "You cannot name her, Chief Executive Officer." Kenneth roared, his voice echoing off the acoustic glass walls. "My father is blinded by sentiment. Gwen is a criminal. She orchestrated a catastrophic zoning fraud that will cost this firm tens of millions in municipal penalties." He reached into his leather portfolio and extracted the forged Apex Tower addendum. He threw the heavy parchment across the polished wood. It slid to a halt near the center of the table, coming to rest near my fingertips. "That document bears her signature," Kenneth proclaimed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She bypassed the Environmental Review Board. She authorized the Midtown excavation, illegally, exposing us to severe litigation. She is not a leader. She is a liability, and she belongs in a federal penitentiary." Preston seized the opening, his anxious energy suddenly replaced by eager cruelty. "We tried to handle this internally to save her reputation," Preston added, looking at the equity partners with feigned sympathy. "We wanted to protect her, but we cannot let her destroy Tran Heritage Group to satisfy her own ambition." The board members exchanged wary, uncertain glances. The accusation carried severe legal weight. If true, it disqualified me from any executive role and mandated immediate termination. I remained seated. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend my honor. I calmly reached into my briefcase and retrieved a sleek silver cable. I plugged it into the side of my laptop, connecting my machine to the main overhead projector mounted on the ceiling. The large mechanized screen descended smoothly behind Kenneth. I tapped a few keys. The bright, high-resolution image of the Apex Tower addendum illuminated the darkened room, towering over my father's shoulder. "My father claims I signed this document," I said, projecting my voice clearly across the expanse. "Let us examine that claim under a brighter light." I clicked the trackpad, zooming in on the bottom right corner of the document. The digital projection magnified the signature until it filled the entire wall, exposing every minute detail of the cursive script. "Kenneth utilized my digital credentials to spoof the electronic verification," I explained, maintaining direct eye contact with the lead corporate counsel. But he wanted physical insurance. He wanted a wet ink signature to present to the city inspectors, hoping a physical document would preempt any digital scrutiny. So he forged my name by hand. Kenneth scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture of defiant arrogance. "That is a pathetic, desperate lie. You signed it, Gwen. Stop deflecting your failure." I tapped the keyboard again, enhancing the contrast on the projected image. The ink strokes grew sharp, vivid, and undeniable. Notice the distinct feathering on the loops of the letters I instructed the room, adopting the clinical tone of an expert witness. Notice the unique pigment. This is not standard corporate black or generic navy blue ink. This is a very specific, custom-mixed emerald green. A heavy, anticipatory silence fell over the stakeholders. They leaned forward in their high-backed chairs, staring intently at the screen. "My grandfather, Vincent Tran, possesses a vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen." I continued, my gaze shifting to the founder, sitting quietly at the far end of the table. It was a bespoke gift from a European developer 20 years ago. The manufacturer ceased producing that specific emerald pigment a decade ago. It is a rare, irreplaceable tool. I turned my attention back to Kenneth. He had stopped scoffing. His arms fell limply to his sides. A thin sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the recessed lighting. "That pen went missing from my grandfather's estate last month," I stated, stepping away from my chair. "But it did not travel far. Kenneth borrowed it. He thought the old-school ink would lend irrefutable authenticity to his forgery. He did not realize the color itself operated as a unique fingerprint." I walked slowly down the length of the table, my heels clicking a steady rhythm. I stopped just a few feet away from my father. I lifted a hand and pointed directly toward his chest. "Kenneth, would you mind taking the pen out of your breast pocket?" I asked, my tone polite, clinical, and lethal. Kenneth froze. The air left his lungs in a sharp hiss. The eyes of every powerful investor, attorney, and executive in the room snapped to the left side of his dark pinstripe suit. A sliver of polished gold and black resin peeked out from the fine fabric of his pocket, catching the ambient light. "Take it out," Kenneth Vincent commanded from the opposite end of the room. The patriarch's voice carried the unmistakable weight of ultimate authority. My father's hand trembled. He reached into his pocket with agonizing slowness and withdrew the vintage Mont Blanc pen. He laid it on the mahogany surface. The gold trim shone brightly against the dark wood. It was undeniable proof. The smoking gun rested in plain sight for the entire committee to inspect. The chief equity partner let out a long, shuddering breath. "Good God, Kenneth. You forged a legal permit. You tried to frame your own daughter." "But the forgery is merely a symptom of a much deadlier disease," I announced, turning my back on my father. I walked back to my laptop, my focus razor-sharp. The zoning blunder was not a standalone mistake. It was a chaotic distraction designed to hide a fatal hemorrhage. I exited the signature image and opened the shadow audit files Nathan and I had compiled in the sub-basement. The screen refreshed, displaying a dense, tangled web of offshore routing numbers and Cayman Island holding trusts. While you were busy covering up Preston's incompetence on the Apex Tower project, I explained guiding a laser pointer across the data. I spent the last 48 hours tracking the missing capital from our operational reserves. Kenneth claimed he relocated funds to cover minor departmental shortfalls. The truth is far more sinister. I highlighted the primary offshore account. Preston lost an unprecedented amount of corporate liquidity in an offshore digital currency scheme, I stated, looking directly at my brother. The crypto gamble failed. The money vanished. Preston shrank down in his leather chair, his pristine posture collapsing. The bravado he had displayed at the celebration dinner was gone. He looked like a frightened, cornered child, realizing the adults had discovered his darkest secret. Kenneth could not allow his chosen heir to face the consequences of his actions. I pressed on, shifting the projection to a new set of devastating documents. So, he orchestrated a rapid influx of capital to plug the hole and hide the losses from this board. He did not have cash on hand. Therefore, he used our legacy. The Uniform Commercial Code financing statements appeared on the giant screen. The stark legal language outlined the terms of several predatory shadow loans, complete with the signatures of the holding companies. "These are high-interest, short-term collateral agreements," I clarified, pointing to the bottom of the files where the asset lists were displayed. Kenneth leveraged the Fifth Avenue retail pavilion. He mortgaged the Soho commercial blocks. He placed hidden liens on our most iconic historical properties to secure secret loans from predatory lenders. Chaos erupted once more, but this time it was not fueled by confusion. It was fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. The senior partners leaped from their seats. The lead corporate counsel grabbed his head in his hands, staring at the screen in disbelief. "He collateralized Fifth Avenue," one investor shouted, his face pale with profound horror. "Those buildings are the anchor of our entire portfolio. They are untouchable." I swiped to the final slide in my presentation. It displayed a stark red countdown calendar. "The first major balloon payment triggers in exactly 30 days, I informed the panicked room, my voice slicing through the noise. If Tran Heritage Group fails to produce the capital, the creditors will execute the liens. They will seize the pavilion. They will take Soho. The core assets of this century-old enterprise will be liquidated, and this firm will cease to exist." The revelation landed with the concussive force of an earthquake. The board members realized they were not just witnessing a messy family dispute over executive titles. They were staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. Kenneth and Preston had not merely been incompetent. They had committed multi-million-dollar fraud, jeopardizing the livelihoods of thousands of employees and nearly erasing the empire Vincent had built from nothing. Kenneth stood frozen at the podium. a disgraced king watching his castle crumble into dust. His meticulous lies had been exposed, verified, and broadcast for the entire executive committee to judge. He had nothing left to leverage. No more threats, no more stolen authority. The silence that followed the uproar was suffocating. The stakeholders stared at Kenneth and Preston with unvarnished disgust. The reckoning had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. Yet the architects of this disaster were not quite ready to accept their fate. As the reality of federal prison loomed over them, the dynamic shifted from defiance to a sickening, desperate display of manipulation. They were about to weaponize the only tactic they had left, setting the stage for the final, brutal confrontation. The boardroom descended into a perilous, suffocating dread. The sheer scale of the financial ruin hung over the mahogany table like a suspended guillotine. The elite stakeholders, men and women who had spent their entire careers guarding the assets of this empire, snapped into immediate, ruthless action. The lead corporate counsel wasted no time. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, retrieving his mobile phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen as he drafted an emergency correspondence to the Federal Regulatory Commission. The chief equity partner signaled the head of building security, demanding that all executive accounts, building access cards, and corporate servers tied to my father and brother be frozen without delay. Kenneth collapsed into his high-backed leather chair, his spine bowing under the crushing weight of his exposed crimes. His pinstripe suit, once an impenetrable armor of intimidation, now looked like a borrowed costume draped over a defeated hollow shell. He stared blankly at the digital countdown projected on the wall, the red numbers signaling the impending doom of the shadow loans. He realized the legacy empire he had attempted to steal was seconds away from turning into his federal prison cell. Preston looked as though he was drowning in the climate-controlled air. He tugged frantically at the knot of his silk tie, his chest heaving with shallow, erratic breaths. The offshore cryptocurrency gambles were his doing, born of his own reckless greed, but he lacked the internal fortitude to face the consequences. He looked toward his father for salvation, his eyes wide with panic, but Kenneth offered nothing. The invincible patriarch was gone, leaving the golden heir entirely defenseless. From the quiet gallery section, the delicate rustle of expensive silk broke the heavy tension. Vivian stood up. The pristine, unbothered socialite persona she had cultivated and weaponized for 3 decades melted away, revealing a frantic, desperate woman. She stepped out from behind the velvet rope, her designer heels echoing sharply across the hardwood floor. She bypassed the furious investors and the scrambling legal advisors, making a direct line for the center of the table, where I stood, holding the remote to the projector. She reached out, grasping the edge of the polished mahogany surface. Her knuckles turned a stark bone white. Her eyes, usually pools of calculated judgment and cold disdain, brimmed with terrified tears. She looked at the damning projections on the wall, then at the furious legal counsel dialing his phone, and finally, she looked at me. "Gwen, please," Vivian pleaded, her voice cracking in a raw, ragged way I had never heard before. Her tone was stripped of its usual haughty command. It was a visceral, unfiltered beg. "You cannot let them call the authorities. You cannot send your father to a federal penitentiary." I looked down at her hands, trembling against the dark wood. This was the woman who had spent my entire life evaluating my worth based on my silent utility. Vivian reached further, attempting to grab my wrist, but I stepped back, remaining just out of her physical reach. "We made a mistake," she cried, tears spilling over her manicured cheeks, ruining her flawless makeup. "We were trying to protect Preston, but we went too far. I see that now. We were blinded by the debt. But you can fix this, Gwen. You have the mind for it. You can restructure the debt, negotiate with the shadow lenders, and bury these offshore accounts before the regulators arrive. You can save us. The board members stopped talking. The phones were lowered. The entire room watched the matriarch of the Tran family beg her discarded, scapegoated daughter to orchestrate a criminal cover-up to save their luxurious lifestyle. "We are your blood," Gwen Vivian implored, weaponizing the concept she had used to control and subjugate me since childhood. "You have a responsibility to this family. We raised you. We provided for your education. You cannot throw us to the wolves. Family protects family. Please forgive us." I listened to her desperate pleas, letting the words echo in the silent, cavernous room. She invoked the sacred duty of kinship. She demanded loyalty in the name of a bond she had never actually honored. For 31 years, that specific psychological manipulation would have worked flawlessly. I would have folded, swallowed my pride, and worked 100-hour weeks to clean up their catastrophic mess, sacrificing my own future just to earn a fleeting, conditional smile of approval. But I was no longer the frightened girl seeking a mother's warmth. The profound clarity I found while recovering alone in a sterile medical ward had fortified my soul. The emotional chains were already broken. "You want to discuss my responsibility to this family?" I asked, my voice calm, flat, and devoid of any emotional turbulence. "You want to talk about how family protects family?" I turned back to my laptop. The financial ruin of Tran Heritage Group vanished from the overhead projector. I opened the final unlabeled folder resting on my desktop, the folder containing the most important evidence I had gathered. "Let us examine the true nature of our blood ties," I said, clicking the trackpad. The giant screen illuminated with a new image. It was a stark, clinical spreadsheet downloaded directly from the Mount Sinai Hospital database. It was the official visitor log from the surgical ward. My name, Gwen Tran, sat at the top in bold black letters, followed by the date of my emergency ectopic pregnancy surgery. Below my name was a grid detailing visiting hours, authorized guests, and family check-ins for the duration of my critical care stay. The columns stretched across the projection, stark, empty, and undeniable. I read the entries aloud, my voice steady and clear, carrying to the furthest corners of the boardroom. Day 1, visitors, none. Day 2, visitors, none. Day 3, visitors, none. The silence in the boardroom turned brittle and freezing. The veteran investors stared at the grim, depressing reality of the hospital record, the visual proof of a daughter abandoned during her darkest hour. I tapped a key and a second image appeared directly beside the medical log. It was a high-resolution screenshot taken from Vivian's social media account, time-stamped on the exact evening I was lying on an operating table, bleeding internally. The photograph displayed Vivian and Audrey sitting in a luxurious sunlit bakery in Manhattan. They were smiling brightly, holding crystal champagne flutes and delicate silver forks poised over a massive tiered wedding cake. Below the image sat the caption my mother had typed while I was fighting for my life. "Family first." I read the caption aloud, letting the staggering, grotesque hypocrisy settle over the room. I stepped away from the laptop, walking until I stood directly in front of Vivian. Her tears had stopped. She stared at the screen, her face draining of all remaining color, as her darkest, most shameful failure was broadcast to the very high society peers she sought to impress. Kenneth covered his face with his hands, unable to look at the screen. "I called you from the emergency room," I stated, addressing my parents, refusing to let them look away. "I told you I was terrified. I told you I might not survive the emergency surgery. I begged for my mother and my father to come to the hospital. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members. Several of the veteran developers shook their heads in silent, profound disgust. You told me you were busy tasting cake for Preston's wedding. I continued my gaze, snapping back to Vivian, pinning her in place. You abandoned your daughter to die alone because you prioritized a catering menu over my survival. You demanded loyalty, but you offered nothing but cold neglect. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, attempting to offer some hollow justification, but the words died in her throat. There was no defense against the hard, documented truth. The receipts were final. You both spent years telling me I was nothing but a workhorse, I declared, raising my voice so it carried the full weight of my newly acquired authority. You told me I had no head for business. You demanded I act like a cold, calculating executive instead of a daughter. I looked from Vivian to Kenneth, and finally to the trembling Heir at the table. So I am, I said, delivering the final verdict. You are all fired. The words struck like a physical blow. The lead counsel nodded in grim agreement, already drafting the termination clauses on his legal pad. Preston shattered. The polished veneer of the golden sun disintegrated entirely. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with loud, uncontrollable sobs. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him, crushing his unearned arrogance. He possessed no skills, no actual work experience, and soon, no wealth to hide behind. His offshore accounts were exposed, his trust fund would be seized by federal investigators, and his luxury wedding was nothing but a mirage built on stolen funds. Gwen, please, Preston wept, looking up at me with a tear-streaked, pathetic grimace. What am I supposed to do? I have bills. Audrey is expecting the penthouse. I do not have a resume. I do not know how to find a real job in the actual world. What are we supposed to do now? He reached out across the table, his hands grasping at the empty air, begging his older sister to fix his life one last time. I looked down at the brother who had taken the credit for my triumphs, the brother who had stolen my bonus, the brother who had stood by while our parents tried to frame me for a felony. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt the pure, sweet release of a burden lifted from my shoulders forever. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white silk blouse. I reached down and picked up my heavy leather briefcase from the mahogany table, snapping the brass locks securely shut. I looked at the sobbing Heir, then at my weeping mother, and finally at my broken, defeated father. I cannot deal with your unemployment right now, I said, echoing the exact chilling excuse they had used while I lay bleeding in the hospital. I have got a company to run. The aftermath of that boardroom execution rippled through Manhattan high society with the swift, ruthless efficiency of a winter storm. The Federal Regulatory Commission descended upon Tran Heritage Group the following morning. Armed with the forensic audit Nathan and I had meticulously prepared, the investigators froze every asset linked to my father and brother. News of the embezzlement leaked to the financial press by the end of the week, splashing their misdeeds across the front pages of reputable business journals. The exposure acted as a permanent social exile for Kenneth and Vivian. The elite circles they had worshipped instantly closed their doors. Charity gala invitations vanished into thin air. Longtime country club memberships were revoked without a single word of explanation. Former friends refused to return their frantic phone calls, treating their sudden downfall like a contagious disease. Stripped of the corporate expense accounts and facing a mountain of legal defense fees to avoid federal incarceration, my parents were forced to liquidate everything. They sold the Upper East Side penthouse at a significant loss just to cover their retaining attorneys. They quietly relocated to a cramped two-bedroom rental apartment in a nondescript New Jersey suburb. Kenneth, A man who once commanded boardrooms with terrifying authority now spends his days arguing with junior public defenders and reviewing court summons at a laminate kitchen table. I received one final email from Vivian a month after the coup. It was a thinly veiled demand for a personal loan, wrapped in the familiar toxic language of maternal obligation, claiming she needed funds for basic living expenses. I did not reply. I forwarded the message directly to our corporate legal department and permanently blocked her contact information. Preston experienced a particularly brutal collision with reality. When the luxury wedding budget evaporated into the hands of federal auditors, Audrey abruptly ended their engagement. She packed her designer bags and left their apartment, taking the expensive engagement ring with her to cover what she deemed emotional damages. Bankrupted and stripped of his unearned executive title, the golden heir was forced to enter the actual job market. Without my father to shield him from his own incompetence, Preston discovered exactly how little a tan cashmere blazer and a confident smirk were worth in the real world. He eventually secured employment as a mid-level leasing agent in a dreary commercial building situated deep in the garment district. He commutes on a crowded subway, a stark departure from the chauffeured black cars he once demanded. He spends his days trapped in a gray, windowless cubicle, cold calling skeptical tenants and struggling to meet minimal monthly quotas. He has no idea that the property management firm signing his meager paychecks is a newly acquired subsidiary of Tran Heritage Group. I am, in a very quiet, poetic sense, his ultimate employer. I do not interfere with his daily struggles. I do not order my managers to treat him poorly or fire him. I simply let the reality of his own merit dictate his future. The sheer weight of normal, everyday labor is punishment enough for a man who believed the world owed him endless luxury. 6 months passed. The transition period required grueling, relentless effort, but the burden felt entirely different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of unappreciated servitude. It was the invigorating challenge of building my own legacy. Tran Heritage Group stabilized, then began to flourish. We restructured the predatory shadow debt Kenneth had incurred, securing favorable terms through transparent, honest negotiations with our primary lenders. I overhauled the corporate culture, dismantling the nepotistic hierarchy and implementing a strict meritocracy. Hard work, innovation, and integrity became the exclusive metrics for advancement. My office on the 52nd floor transformed from a space of silent endurance into a command center of genuine innovation. The prized plant resting near the floor-to-ceiling windows, which had nearly withered during my hospital stay, grew vibrant and strong under consistent, attentive care. The true resolution of this journey did not take place in a Manhattan skyscraper. It unfolded on a crisp, sunlit Saturday afternoon in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Nathan and I chose a location far removed from the toxic, performative glitz of high society. We rented a historic, secluded vineyard surrounded by rolling green hills and the tranquil, mirror-like surface of the deep blue water. The air smelled of pine needles and fresh soil, a grounding fragrance that washed away the residual stress of the city. There were no extravagant ice sculptures, no forced networking opportunities, and no superficial champagne toasts. The guest list was small, intimate, and carefully curated. We invited the junior analysts who had stood by me during the transition, the dedicated mentors who returned my calls after the truth emerged, and the friends who had proven their loyalty through action rather than mere words. Kenneth, Vivian, and Preston were entirely absent from the ceremony. I looked out over the rows of wooden chairs and felt a profound, breathtaking sense of peace. Their absence was not a tragedy to mourn. It was a hard-won victory to celebrate. The empty space they left behind allowed genuine joy to fill the air, unburdened by judgment or manipulation. The string quartet began to play a soft, melodic arrangement. I stood at the edge of the stone pathway, wearing a simple, elegant silk gown. Grandpa Vincent stepped up beside me. He leaned on his polished wooden cane, his eyes crinkling with deep, authentic pride. He offered me his arm. I looped my hand through his, feeling the steady, reassuring strength of the man who had recognized my worth when my own parents had discarded me. Together we walked down the aisle toward Nathan. My fiancé stood waiting under an arbor of white roses, his eyes shining with unshed tears and boundless love. He was the man who had watered my plants, built the forensic spreadsheets, and held my hand in the darkest, most terrifying moments. He was my chosen family. If you are listening to this story right now, and you find yourself constantly pouring your energy into people who only take, I need you to hear this truth. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep someone else warm. Toxic people will always frame your boundaries as cruelty because your self-respect disrupts their ability to exploit you. They will use the concept of blood relation as a weapon to demand unconditional loyalty while offering none in return. Do not let them convince you that enduring abuse is a noble sacrifice. It is not selfish to demand respect. Keeping records, saving emails, and documenting your truth is not petty. It is an act of essential self-defense against individuals who rely on deception to maintain their power. Family is not a biological accident determined by a shared last name. True family consists of the people who show up when your world shatters. They are the ones who sit by your hospital bed when you are frightened. They are the ones who help you rebuild the pieces when you hit rock bottom. The individuals who abandoned me to taste cake thought they were discarding a mindless worker. Instead, they unleashed the architect of their own downfall. You hold the pen to your own story. You possess the power to close the chapter on the people who refuse to value you. Walk away from the tables where your worth is constantly debated. Build your own empire. Nurture your own peace. And remember, the most important lesson I learned in that corporate boardroom: the greatest revenge is a life well lived. The echo of a gavel striking mahogany. The terrified silence of a boardroom. The sight of a once invincible patriarch shrinking into the shadow of his own forged legacy. When we hear stories of spectacular corporate downfalls, we are conditioned to view them through the cold, clinical lens of business. But if you look closely at the ruins of Tran Heritage Group, you will not find a business tragedy. You will find a parenting tragedy. The collapse of an empire is rarely born in a boardroom. It is seeded decades earlier, around a dining room table, in the quiet, devastating moments where parents decide who their children are allowed to be. Gwen Tran's journey from a hospitalized, abandoned daughter to the ruthless architect of her family's reckoning offers an unsettling mirror to our understanding of family responsibility. In American culture, we place an immense premium on the family legacy and the preservation of generational wealth. Yet beneath the veneer of country club dinners and tailored structures, traditional family structures can harbor a toxic, silent disease: the conditional assignment of worth. Consider the mythology of the golden child, embodied so tragically by Preston. Kenneth and Vivian Tran made a conscious, catastrophic parenting choice. They decided that their son's ego was more fragile and therefore more valuable than their daughter's reality. When a 12-year-old Preston smashed his sister's flawless architectural model, their father did not teach him accountability. He glued the broken pieces together and submitted it under his son's name, justifying the deceit with the insidious belief that boys need the confidence. When we shield our children from the consequences of their incompetence, we do not protect them. we disarm them. We send them out into a ruthless world wearing armor made of paper. Preston's eventual destruction, weeping in a boardroom utterly devoid of the skills required to survive, was orchestrated by the parents who loved the idea of an heir more than they loved the boy himself. True family responsibility demands the excruciating courage to let our children fail, to hold them accountable, and to teach them that respect is earned through integrity. Conversely, we must examine the cost of treating a child as a utility. Gwen was raised to be the workhorse, the silent engine that powered the family's grand illusions. American culture often glorifies the relentless worker, the resilient daughter who shoulders the burden without complaint. But when this dynamic is maliciously exploited within a family, it creates a profound emotional void. Honesty and emotional awareness are the bedrock of healthy child rearing. Kenneth and Vivian lacked both. The absolute failure of their emotional awareness culminated in that sterile room at Mount Sinai Hospital. A mother prioritizing a cake tasting over her daughter's emergency surgery exposes the dark underbelly of the family first mantra. For the trans, family first did not mean love, protection, or presence. It meant preserving the optics. When parents view their children as extensions of their own egos rather than separate feeling individuals, they do not raise a family. They raise hostages, yet hostages eventually learn how to pick the locks. Gwen's meticulous gathering of receipts, the visitor logs, the forged emerald ink, the offshore routing numbers, was not an act of malice. It was a necessary act of self-preservation that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about traditional loyalty. We are taught from a young age that family protects family, that blood is a sacred bond, and that maintaining the family unit is the highest moral imperative. But what happens when the family unit is the very thing destroying you? We must stop teaching our children that loyalty is synonymous with silent suffering. We must instill in them the profound, long-term guidance that boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the ultimate expression of self-respect. Parenting, at its core, is the long-term guidance of a soul. It requires a fierce, unwavering commitment to fairness. It requires the honesty to look at our children and see them for who they truly are, not for who we need them to be to satisfy our own unresolved insecurities. If we build our families on a foundation of deceit, favoritism, and conditional affection, we are simply constructing our own emotional ruins. We are guaranteeing that one day, the children we marginalized will realize their own strength, and they will walk away, leaving us alone in the hollow castles we sacrificed them to build. If this story resonates with the quiet, unspoken struggles you have faced in your own life, if you have ever had to unlearn the toxic lessons disguised as traditional family values, you are not alone. The journey to reclaiming your worth is often solitary, but it does not have to be silent. I invite you to subscribe and follow Jessica Told Stories. Join our community as we continue to share narratives that shine a light on the hidden corners of the human experience, exploring the messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful realities of life, love, and family. As we close the chapter on the Tran family's spectacular collapse, we are left to ponder the conventional wisdom that dictates our lives. We are told ad nauseum that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to believe that severing ties with our parents or siblings is the ultimate unnatural act, a moral failure that reflects poorly on the one who walks away. But perhaps we have been looking at the equation backward all along. Blood is not a mystical, unbreakable bond. It is merely a biological coincidence. It does not automatically grant someone the right to your peace, your sanity, or your future. The true tragedy of the human experience is not the severing of a toxic family tie. The true tragedy is the lifetime a person wastes trying to maintain it. pouring their limitless love into a bottomless void, hoping that one day the people who repeatedly chose to abandon them will suddenly choose to stay. You do not owe your life to the people who gave you life, especially if they only gave it to you so you could serve theirs. The most radical, defiant act of love you can ever commit is the moment you stop waiting for the people who hurt you to heal you, and you finally walk out of their boardroom. Where does your loyalty truly lie? Is it with the history you were born into, or the future you have the courage to build?